Make the Ghost of It, Book 3 in the Witchwood's Funeral Home series, written by Morgana Best, narrated by Amy Soakes. Chapter 1. I was in shock. Not only had Basil Sandalwood, my accountant and my crush, just tried to kiss me, but he had clearly seen Ernie, the cranky old ghost who haunted the funeral home. In fact, Basil would have kissed me if Ernie had not interrupted us. Right now, as strange as it might sound, I was not focusing on Basil kissing me. No, I was taken aback that Basil had seen Ernie. I stared at Basil with a mixture of longing and accusation. He held his hands up in front of him. "Look, Laurel, I wanted to tell you that I can see ghosts, but I thought you'd think I was crazy. And you can see them too?" I frowned. I supposed I couldn't be cross with him for not telling me that he could see ghosts when I was guilty of the same omission. Ernie chose that point to rematerialize. "Imagine not knowing that your friend here could see ghosts too," he said, winking as he said the word friend. "What, did you know he could?" I asked him, forgetting about Basil for the moment. "Of course," Ernie exclaimed. I was annoyed. "Well, why didn't you tell me?" Ernie shrugged. "You didn't ask." I frowned at him before turning my attention back to Basil. I've been able to see ghosts since I was a child. As you can imagine, it didn't go down well with my overly religious mother. My father seemed okay with it, though, but he was never allowed to express his opinion. "And you?" Basil nodded. "I've been able to see ghosts for as long as I can remember. I figure my parents thought I had a lot of imaginary friends. Anyway, how are you feeling now? That must have been a horrible shock, that Anna Stiles trying to kill you. You must have been so afraid." He put his arm around my shoulders and drew me close. Just as I was enjoying Basil's proximity, my mother burst into the room. "Fear is not of God," she declared. "Laurel, you're late for dinner. Go home and make yourself some now. Stop inconveniencing people." I was furious, more than furious. I had somehow managed to put up with my mother since I had moved back to the little town of Witchwoods to run the funeral home. At first, I had missed the bustling city of Melbourne, but I had grown accustomed to the quiet life here. However, nothing would ever make me grow accustomed to my mother. I put my hands on my hips. "Now, Mum, listen to me. This is my funeral home. I will go back to your house and collect my things, but I'm not living with you any longer. You have to learn to speak to me politely. I'm an adult now, and you need to respect me. This is also my business. If you can't speak politely to me within the walls of my own business, then you must leave. Do you understand?" She didn't speak, but stood there, her face growing redder by the second. I pushed on. "I'm going to live in the apartment above the funeral home from now on." My mother sputtered, and it took her a few moments to find her voice. "But it's not fit to live in." "That's my problem, Mum, not yours," I said firmly. "Why, you always were a little—" Fortunately, she never had the opportunity to finish her words because Basil cut her off. "Mrs. Bay, please do not attempt to speak rudely to Laurel again, especially not in my presence. I take a very dim view of verbal abuse." I could see that Mum was caught between a rock and a hard place. As much as she liked to speak rudely to me, she was a people pleaser, so she clearly had no idea how to respond. "Yes, Basil," she said politely. "Of course you're right." She shot him a winning smile and then shot a glare at me before vanishing through the door. Basil jabbed his finger at the ceiling. "Can you really live in the apartment up there?" "It's not in the best of condition," I said, "but it's got one thing going for it." Basil looked puzzled. "What's that?" "Mum's not in it." Basil smiled. Chapter 2. I woke up and stretched, momentarily disoriented. Where was I? I looked around me. I was lying on a blanket on a wooden floor in my new apartment. I watched for a moment as particles of dust happily danced along the beams of sunlight streaming in through the bare windows. There was no bathroom, so I would have to use the funeral home's bathroom. That wasn't such a problem, as it was only downstairs in the same building. There was even a shower in the preparation room for Janet the cosmetician to use. Well, there actually was a bathroom in my apartment, but it wasn't plumbed in yet. I planned to call the plumber later that day. The energy in the apartment felt infinitely better than Mum's house, but I did want my privacy here, so I had to figure out a way to keep Ernie out. Having him materialize in my private quarters could prove embarrassing, and ghosts were drawn to the funeral home. The apartment already smelt nice because I had fetched all my belongings from my mother's house, and those belongings included all my scented candles, items which Mum said were of the devil, or, as she liked to call him, the D word. Still, I wouldn't have to worry about Mum now that I wasn't living under her roof. So what if I had to camp out in a non-renovated apartment? I should have done this as soon as I arrived in town. I sneezed violently, due no doubt to all the dust in the air. The night before, I had swept the dust out of the room that I was going to camp in at night, but the other rooms were used as storerooms and were even dustier. I had to make time in my busy schedule to clean them. I sat up and hugged my knees to me. The night before had been wonderful. Basil had returned after I had brought all my new belongings to my apartment, bringing with him a pizza and a bottle of red wine. We had a kind of a picnic on the little oasis of swept floor in the middle of the dusty room. We'd had an enjoyable talk about our shared ability to see ghosts. Just as he had left, he had kissed me again. I tingled from my head to my toes at the thought. A loud knock at the front door of the funeral home brought me back to the present. There were no bookings today, and I had intended to spend the day renovating my apartment. I hurried down the stairs and opened the front door. There, to my horror, were Mum and her best friend Ian standing on the doorstep. Ian was about my age, and I always wondered why he and Mum were best friends. The only thing they had in common was that they were both religious fanatics. Even Pastor Green was frightened of them, of that I had no doubt. Mum was smiling, which I took as a warning sign. It was then that I noticed she had a large black trash bag in her hand. She handed it to me quite proudly. "It's a gift," she beamed at me. "Your mother is so generous to you, dear," Ian said to me. "Please don't call me dear, Ian," I said. "You can't be any older than I am." Ian did not respond, but continued to smile sickeningly at me. Before I looked in the trash bag, I was overwhelmed by the smell of mothballs. It was as if a government agency had done an experiment to see how strong they could make mothballs so that they could kill the entire population of a town. I tried to hold my breath as I reached inside the bag. I pulled out the most hideous monstrosity I have ever seen in my life. The item appeared to be a set of heavy brocaded curtains, bright cherry-pink swirls with gold-embroidered edges on a bright green background of baby brown-yellow dots. I thought I would be physically sick just looking at it, but that was probably just the smell of mothballs overpowering me. "What is it?" I asked her. "Shouldn't you be thanking your mother?" Ian asked me. I glared at him. At least he hadn't called me dear. "They're curtains, obviously, Laurel," my mother said through clenched teeth. Thanks," I said, still staring at the curtains. It was hard to drag my eyes away from them. "They were your grandmother's," my mother explained to me. "They were never used. Someone gave them to her as a gift, and she hated them." "Imagine that," I said sarcastically, but my sarcasm appeared to be lost on my mother. "Are you going to invite us in for coffee?" Mum said. I thought about refusing, but I supposed there was no harm in giving her coffee in the funeral home. I didn't want to alienate her entirely. I just needed to keep her out of my apartment. "Sure," I said. "Come in." I led them into the funeral home's kitchen and switched on the Nespresso machine. "Ian's upset," Mum announced. I looked at Ian, but he looked fine to me. "What's happened?" I asked him. Mum answered for him. It's for the best. You can't be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. I'm not sure I follow. Mum frowned at me. Audrey, Ian has decided to break up with her because he's an ass. You won't get any argument from me, I said before I could catch myself. To my surprise, Ian agreed. Yes, I'm an ass and she's an ox, he said. We're unequally yoked. I took a while to process that, as I knew better than to ask. Finally I got it. Unequally yoked. Beasts of burden. They meant a donkey. So what's new, Laurel? Ian asked me. I regarded him with suspicion. He was never normally so interested in my business, nor was he usually so polite. He was usually busy telling me that I was headed straight to hell. Well, I'm renovating the apartment upstairs, and I moved in last night. John Jones won't be happy about that, Ian said. I did my best to control my anger at his words. John Jones was a church friend of Mum and Ian's, and he was a particularly persistent man who kept asking me on dates. I had refused every time, but neither John Jones nor Mum nor Ian seemed to get it through their heads that I would never date John Jones, even if he were the last man in the universe. What I do has nothing to do with John Jones. Do you understand me, Ian? I am not dating John Jones, and I never will. Never again mention the name John Jones to me again. Mum and Ian both had identical expressions on their faces, their jaws dropped down and their mouths hanging open, and I could see that both of them were about to respond to my words, and no doubt in not a very pleasant manner, when I was saved by the bell, literally. The bell at the funeral home front door was chiming. This is the sort of thing that happens when I haven't had my first coffee of the day. I had completely forgotten that Basil said he was bringing his old college friend, Lewis Lowes, to meet me this morning on their way to a sporting event. Just what I didn't need, Mum and Ian in the same room as Basil. The three of us raced towards the front door. I managed to get there first. I opened the door to see Basil and an attractive man. Basil smiled warmly at me, but the look he gave Mum and Ian wasn't quite so warm. Hi, Laurel. Hello, Mrs. Bay and Ian, he added with narrowed eyes. I'd like you all to meet my old college friend, Lewis Lowes. He's in town for a couple of days and he wants to go skydiving. Skydiving? I said nervously. You didn't mention skydiving. I thought when you mentioned a sporting event that you meant you were going to watch football or something. Lewis laughed. He stepped forward and kissed my hand. Basil shot him a look as he did so. So you must be the delightful Laurel, Lewis said in a tone that made my flesh crawl. He also kissed my mother's hand. And you must be her delightful sister. Mum laughed. Clearly she was taken with the man and didn't realize he didn't actually think she was my sister. I'm in fact Laurel's mother, she said, smiling from ear to ear at Lewis. You can call me Thelma. Lewis faked a look of shock. Oh, you must be kidding. Why, you must have been a child bride. Mum giggled like a schoolgirl, while Ian looked entirely puzzled. I was expecting Ian to say, liars don't inherit the kingdom of God, but he wisely remained silent. I summed up Lewis. He looked like the actor who had played Arthur in the TV series Merlin, only older, but he was just as attractive, with thick blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. Clearly, he also worked out, but I suspected he was one of the guys at the gym who always stared at himself in the mirror for far too long. I couldn't say why, but there was something unlikable about him, something that grated on me. Lewis continued. Thelma, may I have permission to take your lovely sister, oh, silly me, I mean your daughter, out to dinner tonight? I was aghast. What was Lewis thinking? What century was this? And why on earth would he do something as bizarre as to ask my mother's permission to date me? I had no answers, only questions. I noticed that Basil looked quite annoyed, and I wondered if Basil hadn't told Lewis what was happening between us. I supposed that nothing was, in fact, happening, but we had kissed more than once now, and a relationship was progressing. Mum opened her mouth to speak, and I could see she was charmed by Lewis, but I got in first. In this century, men usually ask women directly if they want to take them out on a date, I said dryly. They don't ask their parents for their permission. Lewis turned his charm on me. Laurel, would you accompany me to dinner tonight? No, I said. But Basil said you didn't have a boyfriend. I looked at Basil, who was shifting from foot to foot uncomfortably. Now I was beginning to worry. While Basil wasn't technically my boyfriend, yet, I would have sworn that we were developing a relationship. No, I didn't say that, Basil said, shooting an annoyed look at Lewis. Lewis appeared to be unperturbed. How about dinner tomorrow night, Laurel? No, sorry, Lewis, I said firmly but politely. Do you have a boyfriend? Lewis asked me, looking me up and down with a suggestive gaze. His question and his stare both made me decidedly uncomfortable. Basil and I shot each other a glance before looking away, both of us at our own feet. I didn't know what to say, so I changed the subject. So are you an experienced skydiver, Lewis? I asked him. Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. Basil and I used to go skydiving when we were in college. Of course, he couldn't afford to go too often, but my parents were very wealthy, so I went skydiving most weekends. I saw Basil's face flush red. My opinion of Lewis was growing lower by the minute. That's very brave of you, Lewis, my mother said with admiration. I could see she was mightily impressed. Well, I wouldn't call myself a champion skydiver these days, Lewis said with a smirk. I just thought I'd take Basil out and help him brush up on his skydiving skills. And of course, while I'm here, I can help him with any accounting problems that are too much for him. I was really beginning to dislike the man. Oh, so you're an accountant too? My mother asked him. How impressive. Yes, Lewis said. Basil and I studied accounting together at college. I was always top of the class, and he was always second to me. He turned to Basil and playfully slapped him on the shoulder. Basil's always been horribly competitive with me, and that must be awful for him, since I always beat him at everything. Basil laughed. Don't believe a word he says. I could see my mother and Ian thought that Lewis was some kind of accounting superhero. My loyalties lay firmly with Basil. I wondered why he had such a horrible friend as Lewis, but then I realized that Basil probably hadn't seen Lewis much since his college days, and Lewis was only passing through town. I was glad of that. I wouldn't want to have to spend too much time in Lewis's company. Lewis looked at his watch, which must have been a very expensive watch, given that he made a big display of looking at it and holding it in front of him for all of us to see. Oh, my giddy aunt, look at the time. We'd better be heading off to the drop zone, Basil. Where does anyone go skydiving around here? My mother asked him. There's a drop zone not far from here, Basil said. I nodded. Oh, yes, is that the place with all those little planes? I thought they were crop dusting planes. Those ones are crop dusting planes, Basil said, but that's the runway for the skydiving club as well. The clubhouse buildings are just further on down that side road. Be safe, I said to Basil. Basil smiled warmly at me, but Lewis stepped in front of him. Catch you later, Laurel, he said with a wink, looking me up and down once more. I shuddered. Chapter 3. After everyone left, I made some headway. I called and booked the plumber, and I scrubbed all the windows in the apartment. There was a never-ending supply of dust, and soon I was covered with dirt and grime. I had slept in the smaller of the two bedrooms because the master bedroom was being used as a storage room. However, the colours in the smaller bedroom were nightmarish. I suppose the colours might have been fashionable in the 70s or 80s. One wall was painted grape, one wall was painted mustard, and 2 walls were painted the darkest navy blue I had ever seen. I wanted to paint the walls white before I spent another night in the bedroom. The carpets throughout the apartment were a rather hideous shade of blue. Blue is my favourite colour, and this was about the only shade of blue I had seen that I didn't like. I knew that there were timber floorboards under the carpet, so I would save time by not putting down drop sheets for painting. Those carpets were going to go. I could make as much mess as I liked while I was painting and get it all over the carpet, because I was going to pull up the carpet anyway. I enjoy chalk painting furniture, thrift store finds, and so I thought that white chalk paint might look nice on the walls. I mixed equal parts of plaster of Paris and water, and then mixed that with some of the white paint. I supposed that might have worked had I not used a roller. I soon discovered that rollers and chalk paint just don't mix, and there was no way I was going to paint all those walls with just a brush. I used up the small amount of chalk paint I'd made by going around the edges with the brush. I worked feverishly, faster than I normally could have, given the fact that I was able to splash the paint all over the carpet. When I had finished the 4 walls, I stood back to admire my work. It was pretty bad, truth be told, but I suppose that was mainly due to the fact that I would need to paint another coat or 2. One thing was sure, although I wouldn't win any prizes for painting, the room was infinitely brighter already. After an exhausting time of painting, washing, and scrubbing, I decided to walk outside to visit Basil's 2 pet sheep, Arthur and Martha, who grazed in the paddocks that adjoined the funeral home. When Dad died, he left the funeral home building and business with its adjacent 5 acres to me, and the large house next door, as well as a considerable sum of money, to Mum. Mum was terrible with finances and donated any money she could get her hands on to religious causes. She didn't appear to have any discernment as to whether or not the causes were genuine. I walked over to the fish pond and sat on the old seat. It had been my father's. He had made it himself from discarded railway luggage iron and boards. I idly wondered how the goldfish managed to live happily below the thick coating of ice in winter. One of the goldfish, a big one, stuck its head out and eyed me, probably expecting food, but then turned its attention to some mosquito larvae and gobbled them up. I could hear the distinctive call of a popplebonk frog, but couldn't see it. The pond was a happy place. I yawned and stretched, and then made my way back. I had only walked as far as the roses outside the funeral home when Mum appeared. "It's a lovely day, isn't it, Laurel?" I looked at her with suspicion. Why was she in such a good mood? It wasn't like her at all. "Yes, it's a lovely day," I agreed tersely. "Come over to my house and see what I have done with my garden now," Mum said. She was very proud of her garden, and she was at her nicest when she was showing me around her garden. To be more accurate, it was the only time she was nice to me. I followed her back to her garden and saw with dismay that John Jones was there, bending over a rhododendron. "John Jones is here," I hissed at my mother. "I told you I'm never going to date him." Mum scowled at me. "Why are you always so paranoid, Laurel? I have a few people from the church over to help me with my garden." She shot me a look of such pure innocence that I would have believed her had I not known better. She grabbed my arm. "Look, Janet's here too." Janet was furiously pulling out weeds, and probably a few good plants along with them. I smiled at Janet, and she walked straight over to me. "I see your mother has invited us to cover up for the fact that she's trying to get you to date John Jones," she said with her usual truthfulness. Janet always said what she thought, even if it was incredibly tactless. Mum scurried away. She was no match for Janet. "Yes, Mum just won't give up," I said. "I'm thinking I should date John Jones," Janet said. "It's just that I have a thing against comb-overs. Still, he does go to my church and I'm desperate. There's not much in the way of men to choose from in my church, and my biological clock is ticking. You want children? I said with surprise. I didn't know you liked them. I can't stand the little... Janet broke off, looked thoughtful, and then continued. The little dears. What if I get older and then find that I wanted them after all? Perhaps I'll like children in my old age. Have you ever considered dating a man who doesn't go to your church? I asked her. There are plenty of other churches around. Janet looked at me as if I had gone mad. No, Laurel. Our church is the only one that's right. Everyone else in the world is going to hell. I shrugged. At least Janet admitted it. My mother thought the same thing, but denied it vehemently. And, speak of the devil, I looked up to see Mum pulling John Jones towards me. "Hello, Laurel," he said with a big grin. I sighed. "Hello, John. You're looking lovely today," he said. "Are you kidding?" Janet said. "She's covered in paint and she isn't wearing any makeup. I'd like to scrub her face and put some makeup on her, but I only do that to dead people." She smiled seductively at John, but he cowered away from her. I left them alone and hurried over to Ian, as he was a lesser evil than John. At least Ian wasn't pursuing me. Ian was pulling out pansies that he appeared to think were weeds, but Mum was too much of a people-pleaser to say anything. "Ian, those are actually not weeds, they're pansies," I said. I didn't want to hurt his feelings, but I didn't think it right that he was killing Mum's plants either. Ian did not appear to mind, but instead tossed a pansy over his shoulder and pointed to the sky with his trowel. "There's that skydiving plane. If God wanted us to fly, he would have given us wings." "How did you get here today, Ian?" I asked him. Ian looked puzzled. "In a car, of course, dear." I folded my arms. "Well, dear, if God meant you to drive, he would have given you wheels." Mum and Ian burst into laughter as if I had said something bizarrely stupid. I was surprised. I thought Mum would scold me for twisting things like she usually did. Instead, she looked up at the sky. "Isn't that Louis Lowe such a lovely man? He probably goes to a branch of our church, given that he's so nice. Don't you think so, Ian?" I could see that Ian didn't agree, but there was no way he was going to say that. "We should invite him to our church," he said, "so he can repent for his lies." "What a great idea, Ian," Mum said. "He can sit between us." That seemed to cheer up Ian. "Yes, and we can invite him to the night service as well, and the afternoon service too." Mum clapped her hands with delight. "Good idea, Ian. Now, Laurel, look at these lovely hybrid roses I bought yesterday. I've put them right next to these scented ones." I had to agree that the roses were beautiful, and the scent was as delightful as only roses can convey. Mum was a wonderful gardener. The roses looked gorgeous against the backdrop of the blue flowers of the lavender and the rosemary bushes. I was broken from my thoughts by a cat squealing in fear. I looked up in alarm, hoping the poor animal wasn't injured, when I realized it was only Ian shrieking. He grabbed me by the arm and then let go, and then grabbed Mum by the arm. He then let go of her too and pointed once more to the sky. "Look, in the sky!" he exclaimed. "It's Jesus!" my mother screamed at the top of her lungs. "It's Jesus! It's the rapture! Jesus is appearing in the clouds!" Janet and John hurried over to us. John nodded furiously, while Mum turned to Ian. "See, I told you I was right. Pre-tribulation was right after all, and you always said it was post-tribulation." Ian's face was white. "You were right, Thelma. You were right. It was pre-tribulation after all. And now Jesus is coming in the clouds to gather unto him all who are pure and holy and are not evil sinners." Mum, Ian and John looked at me at that point, while Janet looked at the sky. Ian's and John's faces held something akin to sympathy, but my mother's face clouded over. "I told you, Laurel. I've told you for years and you didn't believe me. Now you are going to suffer a terrible tribulation. They are going to stamp 666 on your forehead, and you won't be able to buy or sell because you're an evil sinner. And now he's come in the clouds to take me, John, Janet, and Ian, and all else who are righteous to heaven, and you will be left here on earth. Don't say I didn't tell you." She waved her finger in my face. I was too shocked to speak. I was only half listening to them because my eyes were fixed on the black spot in the sky, which was growing bigger and bigger and bigger. The black spot was, in fact, heading right for us. Mum and Ian clutched at each other. "Goodbye, Laurel," my mother said gleefully. "We are going to the place where the other holy and pure and righteous ones are going, to be caught up in the sky with Jesus." I was in shock. It seemed to be happening in slow motion. The shape was much bigger now and coming fast. Within moments, the shape crashed into Mum's roof with a deafening thud. Ian burst into tears. "Jesus hit the roof," he said. Chapter 4. I was frozen with shock. Part of my mind had registered the fact that this was someone whose parachute hadn't opened. What if it was Basil? I felt as if I had fallen into another dimension. Everything around me was happening in slow motion. It all seemed so surreal. I heard someone calling my name, but I just stayed locked in my own little world. I tried to force myself into action. I'm usually good in an emergency, and it's only afterwards that I feel the effects. But nothing could be done for whoever it was that had landed on the roof. Finally, Mum managed to get my attention. I looked down to see she was shaking my arm. Her face was white. "Laurel, what should we do?" I just looked at her. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Janet walked over to me and shook my shoulders hard. "Laurel, I've just called the police." I nodded. I could feel myself returning to reality, but the shock was just too much to bear. I looked at Ian and John, and I could see they were feeling the same way that I was. They were still staring at the roof. Luckily, Janet had the presence of mind to call the police. "I wonder if that was Basil," Janet said calmly. "If it was Basil, you'll need to be looking for another accountant, Laurel." She said it in a matter-of-fact voice. Instead of making me even more upset, her words spurred me into action. "We must do something," I exclaimed. I looked at my mother, who was white and shaken. "Laurel, there's nothing you can do," Mum said. It was the nicest tone she had ever used on me. Unfortunately, Janet agreed with her. "Even I won't be able to help him," she said. "They'll be scraping up the pieces and putting them in a plastic bag." I clutched at my stomach and bent over the rose bushes. I thought I was going to be sick. To my surprise, Mum came to my rescue. "Janet," she said, "go to the front and wait for the police." Janet did as she was told. After a few moments, the nausea passed and I straightened up. "I hope it wasn't that wonderful man Lewis," Mum said, looking up at the roof once more. Ian and John had apparently recovered sufficiently to walk over to us, but they didn't speak. Both looked shaken. I heard police sirens in the distance. One of the perks of living in a small country town is that the police are never far away. I hoped that I would soon hear that it wasn't Basil. With that thought, I had to sit down on the grass because I felt as if I was going to faint. I put my head between my legs and hugged my knees to me. I only looked up again when a police vehicle came to a stop near me. I was relieved to see Duncan, my best friend Tara's husband, and one of the 2 police officers in town. Duncan, Tara, and I had gone to high school together. Duncan got out of the car and headed straight for me. I stood up, and he took me by the arm. "It wasn't Basil, Laurel." I sank back to the ground, this time with relief. I shook uncontrollably from head to toe. I had been somehow holding it together, and now that I knew Basil was safe, the relief was having a strange effect on me. "Was it that nice man, Lewis Lowes?" Mum asked Duncan. "Yes, I'm afraid so, Mrs. Bay," he said solemnly. Mum burst into tears, and Ian and John both awkwardly patted her on the back. Duncan was talking to Janet, the only lucid one amongst us. I could see his lips moving, and I was close enough to hear, but I couldn't take it in. Finally, I found my voice. "Is Basil all right?" I asked Duncan. Duncan nodded. "Where is he?" "The detectives will need to question everyone involved," Duncan said. "They're on the way to the clubhouse, and then they'll need to question all of you. Forensics are on their way here now." Duncan kept speaking, but I zoned out again. The relief that Basil was okay was overwhelming. I was still trembling with the shock of what had just happened. Mum, Ian, and John did not seem to be faring much better than I was, although Janet was obviously her usual self. "Even I won't be able to make that body look good," Janet said loudly and gleefully to Duncan. "And I'm sure there won't be a body at any rate." Duncan shot the rest of us a look before putting his hand on Janet's shoulder and mercifully leading her away from us. Duncan said a few words to Janet and then walked back over to us. "I've just asked Janet to take you to the funeral home and make you all a cup of hot tea." I wondered at the wisdom of sending Janet with us, given the way she was physically unable to say anything tactful, but I really didn't feel as if I'd be up to making anyone, even myself, a cup of tea. "Why can't we go to my house?" Mum protested. Duncan shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Bay, but your house will be off-limits until the detectives have cleared it. I suggest you call your insurance company right now." I'd been so worried about Basil that I hadn't thought that Mum's roof would be damaged. Clearly, it had not occurred to her either. I watched as the realization dawned on her, and her hand flew to her mouth. "What? You mean that poor man fell through my roof?" Duncan appeared to be choosing his words carefully. "There's likely to be some damage, Mrs. Bay, but we won't know the extent for a while." Ian spoke up. "We'll just hope and pray that there isn't any damage to the roof, and that will fix it." Mum rounded on Ian. "What do you mean?" she snapped at him. That was the first time I had ever seen her speak like that to Ian. Ian was clearly taken aback. "I just mean, if we think and pray on it, then the roof will be all right." "Don't be so ridiculous, Ian," Mum said angrily. She turned on her heel and stormed off towards the funeral home. For the first time ever, I felt sorry for Ian. "Mum's just upset," I said. "Let's all go to the funeral home, and Janet can make us all some nice hot tea." The three of us duly followed Janet into the funeral home. We found Mum already in the kitchen, her face beet red. "Tea or coffee?" Janet asked us cheerfully. "I think tea would be better, Janet," I said, "given that everyone is so upset." Janet appeared to be genuinely puzzled. "Why would anyone be upset?" If she didn't know, how could I explain it to her? Nevertheless, I attempted to do so. "Well, someone has just died, and—" Janet nodded. "Yes, I see. The insurance mightn't cover the entire cost of the roof." She shot Mum a rare look of sympathy and then turned to me. "How long do you think forensics will take to get here?" "Not soon enough," I said. Janet was a genuinely nice person, but had a real problem being tactful. After Janet made us each a cup of tea, she proceeded to tell us at great length what state the body on the roof would be in. Mum was still on the phone with her insurance company, so luckily for her, she didn't hear any of it. Ian and John looked as though they would faint. I wasn't doing much better. "I'll just go and wait outside in the fresh air," I said. "I'll wait out there until the detectives come to question us." "I'll go with you," John Jones said eagerly. Before he could tell me that he had to protect me because he was my date, or some equally unbearable pronouncement, I held up my hand to forestall him. "No," I exclaimed. "You and Ian should stay here and look after Janet. I don't think the shock has hit her yet. And it never will," I added silently. John agreed with obvious reluctance. I hightailed it out of there into the fresh air. I soon felt much better on my own, away from Janet, Mum, Ian and John, but I was nervous and fidgety. I paced up and down outside the funeral home, hoping forensics or the detectives would arrive soon. I expected I wouldn't feel okay until I saw for myself that Basil was, in fact, all right. Finally, some vehicles approached. They went past me and headed to Mum's house. I hurried after them. Mum's house was in a flurry of activity. Shiny steel extension ladders were produced from a white van, and in no time, people in white suits were shimmying up to Mum's roof. I looked for Basil, but couldn't see him. 2 men in suits were speaking to Duncan and his recently arrived partner Brian, so I assumed that they were the detectives. Duncan saw me looking and waved me over. "Laurel, this is Detective Swan, and this is Detective Brand. Detectives, this is Laurel Bay. She's the daughter of Thelma Bay, who owns the house." Detective Brand focused on me. "So, you were one of the witnesses?" "Yes, I was standing here with my mother, and so were Janet, who works at the funeral home, and Mum's friends, Ian and John." The detective nodded. "We'll take your statements later. Where are the other witnesses?" "They're at the funeral home, having a cup of tea," I said. "This was a terrible shock for all of us." "I'm sure it was," the detective said, but his tone was devoid of sympathy. I expected he had seen too much of this sort of thing, though I imagine not specifically people falling to their deaths from an airplane. I assumed he was hardened by his job. The detective did not appear to want to question me further at this point, so I wandered over to Mum's rose garden, where I could see the proceedings, but not get in the way. Still, it was hard to see anything from the ground. The people in white suits scurried over the roof, and occasionally one of them came back down and placed what I assumed was evidence in the big white van. Soon the others joined me. Mum marched straight up to Duncan. "When will I be allowed back in my house?" she asked loudly. I hurried over to them. Detective Brand asked a question of his own. "Have you contacted your insurance company yet?" he asked her. "Yes, I have," Mum said. "I suggest you get in touch with them again and inform them that there is damage to your roof and it won't be weatherproof at this time." I shuddered. That meant that Lewis Lowes had fallen through Mum's roof. I hadn't liked the man, but I hadn't wished him dead. It was just too gruesome to think about. Mum appeared to be of the same opinion because she waved her hands wildly in the air and wasn't able to say anything further. Just then, the air shimmered in front of me. I thought I was getting a migraine headache, but then it took form. The form of Lewis Lowes. I screamed. At once, everyone's attention focused on me. "It's the stress," I said lamely. "I didn't mean to scream." At least that was the truth. In all the trauma of the day's events, it hadn't occurred to me that Lewis would appear in ghost form. And while his body was probably in a million pieces, I shuddered at the thought. His ghostly form looked just like he had when I had last seen him when he was alive. Lewis winked at me. "You seem surprised to see me, Laurel." I looked around me, but everyone was now looking at the roof. I walked back to stand near Duncan's police vehicle. "Do you know that you're a ghost?" I said. Lewis laughed. "Yes, and I haven't gone to hell. When I was on my way down and my chute didn't open, I was scared that I'd go to hell. But now I'm here, and isn't it wonderful? Now I don't have to pay any taxes or pay back any of my debts." He looked genuinely pleased. I wondered if he had lost his marbles along with his life. Chapter 5. Janet ran over to me. I hadn't seen her that animated since... No, I had never seen her that animated. She threw her hands in the air. "Have you heard the great news?" "There is good news?" I asked her. "But how could there be good news when a man has just been killed, splattered all over Mum's roof?" When I saw Lewis grimace, I realized that it wasn't such a tactful thing to say. "That's just it," she exclaimed gleefully. "One of the nice men from forensics just told me that the body isn't splattered at all? Isn't that the best thing ever? I was at a loss for words. Yes, was all I could manage. There could even be an open viewing. She rubbed her hands together with delight. I noticed that Lewis had gone somewhat white, and it was a revelation to me that ghosts could turn white. That's a surprise, I said. I would have thought that he would have been in a not very good state. My words weren't entirely grammatical, but I was still reeling from the shock. The forensics man said that the fastest Lewis could have been travelling would have been about 185 miles an hour, but given that Lewis was an experienced skydiver, he would have been going a lot slower than that. I mean, he would have been trying to slow himself down, so he would have been in a position to make himself fall much slower. Lewis stepped forward. Yes, that's exactly what I did, he said, and I was looking for some bushes or some muddy ground. I was actually aiming for those bushes over there, but I didn't make it that far. I looked past him to see that he was pointing at a row of alder trees at the edge of the sheep's paddock. But wouldn't landing in trees be just as dangerous as landing on the roof? I asked him. Janet shook her head. The forensics man said that there have been several cases of people who have survived their parachutes not opening. If someone's chute doesn't open and they land in trees, they will likely break all their bones and be in a bad state, but they won't necessarily die. It's much better than landing on the ground, and landing in water is a terrible mistake because water's like concrete to land on. Yes, I've heard that about water, I said. Lewis was muttering to himself. If only I'd jumped out a little bit later, and then I might have made those trees. I wonder why he jumped out when he did, I asked Janet, although I was actually addressing the question to Lewis. I just wanted to jump first, Lewis said. I didn't know that someone had tried to murder me. Oh, well, he or she actually did murder me. He sighed loudly. What, murder? Janet looked at me strangely. What makes you think it was murder? I thought fast. Well, he was an experienced skydiver, and it didn't look to me as if either chute had opened. Before I could stop her, Janet turned. I'll go and ask the detectives, she called over her shoulder. I looked around, but no one was looking at me. So they did something to your chute, packed it wrongly? Lewis nodded. Yes, it was a total malfunction. The risers were cut. I'm sure forensics will soon find that out. My parachute was sabotaged, that's for sure. What are risers? They're the fabric connectors between the harness and the lines. I would guess that the risers for both my main chute and my reserve chute were cut. Janet was speaking to one of the detectives, and he was looking my way. If only she didn't have such a big mouth. I put my hands over my face and pretended to scratch my forehead so I could ask Lewis one more question. Is that the only reason you can think of that both your parachutes wouldn't have opened? Yes, Lewis said, and I hold an FAA Master Parachute Rigger certificate. I'm an expert on the subject, if I do say so myself. He laughed. The detective walked over to me. Janet made to follow him, but he sent her back. So, he said sternly, your cosmetician tells me that you said it was murder. His tone was somewhat accusing. It was a guess, I lied. I could hardly tell him that the victim himself had told me that it was murder. We saw him falling, and it didn't look like his parachute had opened. I know they have a reserve chute, but it didn't look like either of them had opened. He told me he was an experienced skydiver, so I figured it had to be murder. I was worried that the detective knew I was lying. I supposed they had a sixth sense about such things. His eyes narrowed, and he looked at me for a while before speaking again. And is that the only reason you said that? I nodded. And how long have you known Basil Sandalwood? Basil? I echoed. I only met him when I moved back here from Melbourne, when my father died and left me the funeral home. He was my father's accountant, and Basil's father, who has now passed away, was my father's accountant for years. Basil is my accountant now." The cop raised one eyebrow. "Just your accountant?" Luckily for me, the other detective called him away before I had to answer. I saw that the forensics people were bringing down the body from the roof. I watched while they lowered the body. It took 4 of them, but soon they had the body on a gurney and were wheeling it to a van. Janet hurried back over to me. "I overheard them say that they're going to see if there are risers stuck to the body. I don't know what that means. I've never been stupid enough to jump out of a perfectly good plane." "You and me both," I said. "I couldn't ever be that brave." The forensics people drove away, and Duncan walked over to me. "The detectives have asked that you and the others go to the house now for questioning." I looked up to see Mum, Ian, John, and Janet already making their way over to Mum's house. "Are we allowed in Mum's house now?" "Yes." I could see that Duncan looked uncomfortable. "What aren't you telling me, Duncan?" Duncan shifted from one foot to another. "Well, I suppose I should tell you, Laurel, but try not to worry. Basil is the only suspect they have at the moment." "Basil?" I said. "Why on earth would they suspect Basil? What motive would he have?" Duncan shrugged. "Like I said, try not to worry. Hopefully they'll get some results from the DNA testing of the parachute. It's just that Basil was the most likely one." He held up his hand at that point. "I'm not saying I think he was the most likely one, but that's how the detectives will see it. He was an experienced parachutist too, and someone had tampered with the parachute." "But surely anyone had the opportunity to tamper with Lewis's parachute?" I asked him. "I mean, I suppose they can't check it once it's packed, right? If he packed it himself, then whoever did it would have had plenty of time to tamper with it." My head was spinning, and I wasn't sure if my words made sense. They probably hadn't, because Duncan made no attempt to respond, but simply shrugged and walked towards Mum's house. I followed him. When I got there, I found the others in Mum's living room. Mum was on the phone to what sounded like her insurance company, and soon Ian appeared, wearing a frilly pink apron and carrying a tray of coffee. He handed everyone a cup of coffee and a religious tract. "Ian, do you really think that's appropriate?" I said as I took the coffee and refused the religious tract. "We can't miss any opportunity to save the lost," Ian said. "I'm sure that poor man Lewis is burning in hell right as we speak." "I am not!" Lewis yelled loudly. He was right up in Ian's face, but of course I was the only one who could see or hear him. The detectives, who had refused the coffee as well as the religious tract, announced that they would question each one of us in turn. Detective Swan took me into the kitchen. "Do you live here?" he asked me after I had given him my name, address, and date of birth. "No, I just moved out of Mum's house yesterday. I'm now living in the apartment over the funeral home. I own that building and the business, and Mum owns this house." I waved my hand in the direction of the funeral home. "Why did you move out of your mother's house?" he asked me. "My father died recently and left this house and money to Mum, and the funeral home and the business to me. There's an apartment over it that I'm renovating." "And the renovations were finished yesterday?" The officer shot me a penetrating look. "No, not exactly. I just had a big argument with my mother." The detective was still scribbling away furiously on his notepad. He looked up at me. "What was the argument about?" I shrugged. "Well, it wasn't an argument as such. It's just that she and I don't get along." "You'll soon see for yourself what she's like," I added silently. He nodded. "Tell me in your own words what you saw." I wondered who else's words I would use, but I described the scene anyway. Ian pointed to the plane, and we saw a black speck falling from the sky after that. I realized it must be a skydiver, and the parachute didn't open. It kept falling, and then it hit Mum's roof. "And what happened then?" "Janet called the police, and the rest of us were just in shock." "And Janet wasn't in shock?" I tapped my chin. "Janet isn't like other people, socially speaking. She says whatever she thinks. She really doesn't have a social filter." "I see." I doubted that he did see, but I didn't want Janet's tactlessness to make her a murder suspect. It was bad enough that Basil was already a suspect. "All right, thank you, Miss Bay. You can go now. Please send in John Jones." I did as I was told. I wanted to know what was going on with Basil, but I could hardly ask the detectives. After all, if I showed any interest in him, the detectives might think I was his accomplice. My mother's shrill voice snapped me out of my musings. "It's a circus!" she yelled. I crossed to the window to see what she was looking at. There were media cars parked outside her house, and people with microphones and cameras were standing in front of them. "Oh, it's a media circus," Ian said. "What should we do, Thelma?" "Why don't you go and tell them that they're trespassing and ask them to leave?" I said. "Don't be so stupid, Laurel," my mother snapped at me. I shrugged my shoulders. Whatever. "She's not very nice, is she?" Lewis said. I nodded and walked out of the front door. The media ran over to me, and a woman shoved a microphone in front of my face. "Were you a witness to the shocking incident?" she asked dramatically. "No," I said. "I just arrived to console my mother." I pointed to the house where Mum was peering through the curtains. "The detectives are questioning all the witnesses now, and they told me to go away because I don't know anything." To my relief, my words must have been convincing, because the media promptly lost interest in me. I hurried to the funeral home and then to my apartment. In the safety of my apartment, I looked at the walls and the room I was using as my bedroom. Only hours earlier, I had thought my worst worry in the world was that I would need to do more coats of paint. A friend of mine once said that things can turn on a dime, and he was right. Chapter 6. Despite the unfinished state of my apartment, I actually found myself enjoying it. I was away from my mother, which was the initial goal, but I was also enjoying the privacy in general. I wondered if it was, in fact, murder, or simply an accident. Lewis did strike me as the type to make bad decisions, but I doubted he would be careless with his own life. I sighed and decided to make a light lunch with what I had on hand. It wasn't anything exciting, just a basic sandwich, but it was nice to have the freedom to make lunch without somebody telling me that it was the food of the devil, or something like that. I'd just finished lunch when the bell at the front door rang. My heart skipped a beat, and I ran down the stairs as quickly as I could. As I'd hoped, it was Basil. He smiled at me, but there was a definite hint of sadness to it. I realized that even if he hadn't liked the new Lewis, it surely must have been an awful experience, especially when he was the primary suspect in his murder case. "Hi, Laurel." Basil looked like he was struggling to maintain his smile as he spoke. "Basil," I exclaimed excitedly, in spite of myself. "Come in." I ushered him through the door and closed it behind me. "Would you like some coffee?" "Oh, yes, please." His smile seemed more genuine. I thought that perhaps he was worried about seeing me again after our last encounter. He'd come across as if he didn't consider us a couple. Still, that was the least of our problems now. We walked to the funeral home kitchen and I started the coffee machine. "How are you, Basil?" I asked, trying to mask the amount of concern in my voice. I couldn't imagine how hard these last few hours must have been for him. "I'm not great, to be honest." He sighed. "I'm the primary suspect, and for good reason. I was the only other person up there, except the pilot, of course, but he was obviously a little bit too busy flying the plane to—" He swallowed. "To kill Lewis. I've been in questioning, and it's been awful. Obviously they haven't hurt me or anything, but they've tried everything they can that's legal. It's been painful, but at least they've let me go for now. There just wasn't enough evidence to convict me, I suppose." "That's shocking," I exclaimed. I just wanted to hug him, but restrained myself. "I'll be off the hook if they find some DNA in the parachute," Basil continued. "DNA? but there wasn't any blood or anything. They explained it to me. Basil said, "It's called touch DNA. They only need about 8 skin cells. They've taken my DNA, and if they find someone else's DNA inside the chute and not mine, that will discount me as a suspect." "Well, I sure hope whoever it was wasn't wearing gloves when they did it," I said. "It would have to be quite a stupid person not to, sadly." Basil looked upset. I had to agree. I thought it was highly likely that whoever murdered Lewis had worn gloves when they sabotaged his parachute. I smiled at him warmly, trying to raise his spirits. I figured coffee would do him good. Coffee is good for anything, and poured him a cup as soon as it was ready. I knew it was upsetting him, and that he was sick of talking about it, but I needed to know more about what happened to Lewis. "Do you have any idea what happened?" I asked. Basil considered for a moment before answering. "Not entirely, no. Though I know Lewis jumped out earlier than he should have. He wanted to show off, I think. You probably noticed that he was more than a little competitive." He raised an eyebrow at me, and I stifled a laugh. "More than a little, yes," I replied, thinking back to when I'd met him. "Well, I think that's why he jumped early. He hadn't seemed nervous or upset about anything. Honestly, though, he was a very skilled skydiver. He wasn't lying about that, though I'm the better accountant." Basil shot me a genuine smile as he said it, but there was still a very real sadness in his eyes. I hadn't liked Lewis much, but he certainly didn't deserve what happened. I wasn't sure that anybody did. Basil rested his head in his palms. "I don't know what to do. I can't prove that it wasn't me, and I obviously don't have an alibi since I was with him in the plane. The bell rang before Basil could finish, and he looked up at me. I sighed. "I'll be back in a second." I was in the middle of a tender and important moment, which meant the visitor could only be one person. "Hi, Mum," I said, forcing a smile as I opened the door. "Hello, Ian." "Hello, Laurel," they quite creepily said in unison. "Are you inviting us in for a coffee?" my mother asked. "No," I thought, "but you've invited yourself anyway." Aloud, I said, "Sure, come in. Basil is here at the moment, and I've just run the machine through, so your coffee should be quicker than usual." "Hello, Thelma, Ian," Basil said as we all entered the room. His tone had become considerably harsher, and it was clear that he didn't like either of them. It was no wonder. They hadn't exactly given him a reason to be friendly. Still, I liked to avoid drama where I could, so I tried to diffuse the tension a bit. "Would you like coffee as well, Ian?" I asked, desperate to start a conversation of some kind. I detested awkward silences, but I was certain there'd be many to come if I couldn't keep the conversation flowing. "Yes, thank you." Ian sat down. "How are you doing, Basil?" Mum asked him, sounding genuinely concerned. "I'm okay, thank you, Thelma, though I think I might still be in shock." He took a long drink of his coffee after he spoke, seemingly to avoid further conversation on the topic. "If you don't mind my saying so," Mum said, "it seems clear that God has taken Lewis before his time because he was too pure for our corrupt world. He's gone to a much better place." Somehow, Mum's wise words didn't seem to put Basil at ease. We sat and spoke for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only an hour. Basil was very civil, but it was easy to see that he was restless and upset. Easy for me, at least, but apparently not for Ian or my mother. They continued to prod him with questions about Lewis and the case before imparting their wisdom regarding God's plan for the world. Basil managed to sit through the whole thing without so much as flipping the table, though I'm not sure I could have done the same had our positions been reversed. "Well, we'd better get going," Mum said as she stood up. I wanted to say, "It's a miracle," but somehow restrained myself. Basil and I said our goodbyes to Ian and Mum and went back to the kitchen, where I made each of us another coffee. Sorry I don't have a stronger drink, I said, and Basil responded with laughter, despite it not being a joke. I'm glad they're gone, Lewis announced. I very nearly spilled my coffee as Basil and I jumped out of our seats. How long have you been here? I asked angrily. Longer than I'd like. Lewis shot me his trademark creepy smile and walked over to the table. She wouldn't shut up about God's grand plan, would she? Not everybody loves me, but I'm not sure God had a reason to assassinate me. I sighed dramatically, but it occurred to me to ask, do you know who would have a reason to assassinate you? Lewis considered for a moment before replying, As a matter of fact, yes, I think I do. I mean, I'm an auditor, right? And I'm a real good one. Lewis took a moment to flash us a smile before he continued. Or was, rather. His smile vanished, but he continued. I was auditing one of the largest accounting firms in Australia. It's a cruel world. He paused for dramatic effect, but I had no idea what was going on. Lewis seemed rather put out. It's a funny name, right? He asked. I don't get it, I admitted. I know the company and I do get the joke, only it just isn't funny, Basil said dryly. It's a play on the words accrue and cruel. I still didn't get it, but I forced a smile. He went on to explain what accrue meant, but I stared into the distance and wondered where my next chocolate fix was coming from. Lewis frowned. Fair enough, I suppose. Laurel, It's a Cruel World is one of Australia's biggest firms. The name is much funnier if you're into accounting. Probably. Anyway, I'll get to the point. He took a deep breath, something I wasn't sure ghosts needed to do, before continuing. I was auditing the company, as I mentioned, when I found evidence of embezzlement. Somebody was embezzling huge amounts of money, and I do mean huge amounts from the company's trust fund. I called the head of the firm to tell him about it the night before I went skydiving. Lewis took on a much more serious tone when he mentioned the head of the firm, and it was the first time I'd seen him behave seriously. In hindsight, I shouldn't reveal massive fraud before participating in dangerous activities. But hindsight is 50-50, as they say, Lewis joked, and I realized he was, for better or worse, back to his usual self. Do you really think he's responsible for your death? Basil asked. Lewis considered for a moment. I can't say for certain, of course, but it seems likely. I know you didn't do it, Basil, because I'm much too smart for you to kill me. He smiled directly at Basil as he teased him, but also because you really had no motive, outside of Laurel clearly falling for me. He winked at me when he spoke, and I found it a lot less amusing than he did. I also can't think of anybody else with means and motive. This guy could have paid to have me killed 30 times over and got away with it. He was seriously rich, even before he'd stolen a ridiculous amount of money. I mulled it over. This man didn't sound like the sort of person I would want as an enemy, but I supposed that I didn't really want anybody as an enemy. We all talked for several more minutes, but it seemed as though the clues had dried up. We would need to do some investigating of our own to get to the bottom of Lewis's murder. I was worried that Basil was still number one suspect in the eyes of the police. Chapter 7. I took a long, slow sip of my coffee and set it back down on the table. How is it? Tara asked me. It's amazing. I forgot how good the coffee here was, I replied, smiling. Tara and I had decided to catch up. Given all that had happened recently, finding the time to do something simple and relaxing was difficult. We'd talked on the phone and through texts, but there was something a lot nicer about talking in person. Plus, there was coffee. Yeah, it's great. We haven't done this in a while. Tara paused to take a sip before continuing. So what did you want to tell me? Oh, geez, I don't even know where to begin. I sighed. While we had been talking for a long time, I'd kept all of the crazy recent events in my life under wraps. I wanted to tell her, and had planned to do so, but doing it over the phone didn't seem right, considering how dramatic and important it all was. Maybe from the beginning, Tara teased. I laughed and thought about it a bit more. All right, sure. You know Basil. Of course I know Basil, you twit. You don't shut up about him. I laughed again, realizing I couldn't refute her point. Fair enough, but we kissed. As I said it, Tara's mouth dropped open. What? She yelled, causing all the customers at the cafe to stare at us. How could you not tell me this until now? When was it? I swear it had better have been while you were on the way here. It was the night before Lewis Lowes was killed. It feels like longer, though. More than that's happened. Tara tapped impatiently on the table as I took another drink before I continued. He visited me with his friend from college, Lewis. Well, they went skydiving together and... I paused, and Tara looked at me worryingly. And what, Laurel? That was the guy who died, the one whose parachute didn't open. Tara clasped her hand to her mouth. Oh, gosh. She seemed genuinely shocked. Do you know how that happened? Was he an amateur? No, just the opposite. He'd had plenty of experience. Nobody's quite sure how, though Janet said she was told that his parachute wasn't packed properly. Those detectives who are investigating have Basil as a suspect. Didn't Duncan tell you? Tara was completely taken aback. No, not about Basil. I mean, the whole town knows about the skydiving accident, of course, but Duncan didn't tell me that Basil is a suspect. Have you talked to the ghost? Tara was the only one, apart from Basil, who knew I could talk to ghosts. Yes, I said. So what does he think happened? You need to promise me that you won't tell anybody this, I said in a near whisper. Tara nodded calmly. Lewis was auditing a company. It's a cruel world. When I mentioned the name, Tara looked like she was trying to force a smile. No, it's okay. The name isn't funny, I assured her, at which she seemed somewhat relieved. Anyway, Lewis called the head of the company and exposed massive embezzlement fraud the night before he died. I don't mean to sound rude, but why on earth would he decide to make a powerful enemy before he went skydiving? Tara asked. He didn't actually know that the head of the company was the one responsible. Actually, nobody knows if that's even the case yet. He might have just been protecting whoever was responsible for the theft, or it could even be a coincidence. Tara looked concerned. I'm sorry all this has happened, Laurel. How's Basil holding up through it all? He's not doing too well, honestly. On top of his friend dying, he's still a suspect. The prime suspect, really. He was the only person up there with him before the accident, except the pilot, but he couldn't have done anything. I cupped my head in my hands, thinking it was about time for another coffee or three. But you said that the detectives think that maybe his parachute was tampered with. Tara raised an eyebrow as she asked me. Yes, and if that's the case, it could really be anybody. I sighed before excusing myself to get up and order another coffee. When I returned, I found Tara deep in thought. Parachutes have a fail-safe, right? In case it doesn't open the first time? Tara asked me. Yes, I replied, and it failed too, which is apparently extremely rare. Tara nodded. Which is why the detectives suspect foul play, I suppose, especially since you mentioned that he was a skilled parachutist. Tara leaned back in her chair. This is all a bit above my pay grade. I was expecting tales of your latest romantic conquest, not murder conspiracies. Sorry, Tara, I said earnestly. I felt bad about rambling about it, but I'd needed to get it off my chest. So much had happened, and I hadn't really spoken to anybody but Basil about it. A thought occurred to me. You probably suspect Basil, at least a little bit, huh? I'd be lying if I said I didn't, Tara admitted. I don't really know him, Laurel, and he was the only other person on the plane. I believe you if you say he didn't do it, though. Basil can clear his name if they find somebody else's DNA on the parachute, I explained. But why would the killer's DNA be on the parachute in the first place? It's not like they bled on it. Tara looked confused as she asked, and I couldn't help but laugh a little. I asked exactly the same thing, but Basil explained it to me. Apparently it's called touch DNA, and they only need a few skin cells to get a match. If somebody else's DNA is on there, they might stop suspecting Basil entirely. But what if the killer wore gloves? Tara asked. Exactly what I said when Basil explained it to me. Unfortunately, we don't know yet. We've found ourselves talking about murder again, Laurel. Tara smirked. Sorry, I admitted. I shouldn't be talking about it anyway. It's just nice to get it off my chest. Tara laughed. No, it's fine. I didn't mean it like that. I just want to change the subject to something a little bit cheerier before you make me kidnap and interrogate the CEO of a company. Oh no, nothing so cunning, I smiled. I was just going to attack him in his office and hope for the best. Tara laughed again. Well, how about... Before she could finish, Tara was cut off by what sounded like 1,000 cows mooing. I clapped my hands over my ears and looked outside. I'd imagined that the noise could have only come from some kind of otherworldly banshee, and I wasn't too far off. Outside was my mother, standing next to Ian, singing gospel songs. Then again, calling it singing was somewhat of a stretch. I buried my head in my hands. Ian and Mum did this around town on occasion. The only sane explanation would be that they were trying to raise money for some kind of charitable organization, but they wouldn't accept money even if people were willing to pay. Mum had always adamantly stood by the idea that they were showing strangers the voice of God. I figured they were definitely converting people, just probably not to the side that they wanted. That's your mother, isn't it? Tara asked sympathetically, her eyes wide with shock. I resisted the urge to run away from the cafe, but only because it would mean passing by Mum and Ian. Yes, it is, I admitted. I don't know why she does this. It's embarrassing enough when she's in public and isn't singing. I overheard a couple at a nearby seat talking. What on earth is that horrible sound? It's those two outside, that old lady and the little guy. I would have found that funny if I hadn't been so annoyed and upset about it all. I thought about asking if this cafe had a back door. The couple continued to talk about Mum and Ian, as did everyone else in the cafe, but I made an effort not to listen. I saw a man at the back of the cafe stand up and walk towards the door. "Pastor Green!" I exclaimed, jumping out of my seat. "Oh, hello, Laurel." He smiled warmly. "I suppose you didn't come here to spread the screech of God?" I laughed. Pastor Green was a very nice man, but even he was pushed to his limit by my mother. "No, I'm here having coffee. I didn't notice you there, or I would have invited you over." "I didn't notice you either, but the feeling is mutual. Excuse me, though, Laurel. I need to get outside and stop them from scaring away potential churchgoers." He smiled and walked outside. I sat back down opposite Tara and watched the whole event unfold. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the noise cut out as soon as he started talking to the pair and never resumed. After a few minutes, Pastor Green watched them leave, and as Mum walked past the window, I noticed she looked a bit put out. Ian didn't look as perturbed, but I suspected he was just waiting for my mother to tell him how to feel. Pastor Green entered and walked over to the counter before ordering another coffee and sitting down at the table with us. "She cited Psalm 104, verse 33, the pastor said as he sat down. "I had to explain to her that she didn't literally have to sing the Lord's praises." He laughed. "Do you mind if I sit with you?" "Not at all," I said, looking at Tara. "Oh no, that's fine," she said, smiling at Pastor Green. "How are you, Laurel?" he asked after he had retrieved his coffee. "I understand things have been chaotic for you lately." He looked at me with genuine concern. I'm okay, thank you. It's Basil I'm worried about. Honestly, though, I've been talking about it all day, so I'd like to avoid the subject. I hoped I wasn't coming across as rude. Of course, not a problem. And how are you, Tara? Pastor Green asked her. It hadn't occurred to me until then, but I wasn't even sure if they knew each other. Tara wasn't exactly a frequent churchgoer, by which I mean she never went to church, but I supposed in a small town everybody knew everybody else to some degree. I'm well, thank you. Better now that my hearing is starting to return. Tara laughed as she finished speaking, and Pastor Green and I followed suit. I felt a tiny bit bad about laughing at my own mother, but she truly was an awful singer, and we were all better off for her having stopped. Duncan said you had some trouble at the church. He texted this morning to say that something was called in, but he didn't give any details. Oh, that, the pastor said, taking a large gulp of coffee before continuing. It was nothing serious. Actually, it was nothing at all. He sighed, sounding almost embarrassed. Actually, that was Thelma again. He turned to me. Apparently there were bees on the church grounds. So she called the police? I asked, to which the pastor sighed again. I wish. She called the police, an ambulance, and the fire department. Apparently it was just to be on the safe side, to quote Thelma, but they were less than impressed, as was I. He took another sip of his coffee as Tara's jaw dropped open. I dropped my head into my hands again. When I moved out of Mum's house, I should have found somewhere further away. Much further. Chapter 8. I awoke with a start. I looked around my room, but no one was there. I suppose I was getting edgy, what with there being a murderer on the loose. What happened next was a blur, as it always is before I've had my first coffee of the morning. I don't become lucid until I drink at least one cup of coffee. I staggered downstairs to the Nespresso machine, but just as I switched it on, an apparition appeared before me. I know who the murderer is, the apparition screamed as it took shape. It was Lewis. You scared me, I shrieked. Isn't that what everyone says to a ghost? Lewis said with a smirk, but then his smirk changed to a frown. Norbert's here with my girlfriend Violet. Norbert was the one who killed me. He's always been jealous of me, and now he's got my fiancé. I downed my first coffee, a single shot, and then quickly put the first of 2 pods in the Nespresso machine. I was going to need a double shot next. I held up my finger. Wait just a minute. You asked me out when you have a fiancé, and didn't you say Basil was always jealous of you? Lewis floated towards me. I was joking about Basil. Well, no, I wasn't really. Everyone is jealous of me to some degree, because I'm so accomplished, truth be told. But Basil was never malicious about it like Norbert was. And now Norbert's with my fiancée Violet. I sneaked into their hotel room and... Lewis covered his eyes with his hands. I just can't begin to tell you what I saw. Please don't, I said. Now let me get this straight. I put the second pod in the machine. So you're engaged to this Violet, and behind your back she's been having an affair with this Norbert, whoever he is. How should I know? Lewis said angrily. Perhaps their affair started after Norbert killed me, but she sure didn't waste any time. Seriously, Lewis, I don't think everyone has your morals, if you don't mind me saying so. I hardly think that your fiancé would start an affair with someone only a day or 2 after you were murdered. And why didn't you ever happen to mention that you thought Norbert murdered you? It's only just become clear to me now. Lewis slammed his hand on his fist. I watched with interest, wondering why his hand didn't pass straight through. But then again, his clothes didn't pass straight through him either. I was grateful for that. Ernie suddenly appeared next to Lewis. So that's what the shouting's all about. It's the new guy. Oh well, at least it's not dead quiet around here anymore. Ernie doubled over, laughing at his own joke. Something occurred to me. "Lewis, why did you go to Violet's hotel room? Don't you know it's not nice to be a peeping Tom?" Ernie shook his finger at Lewis. "That's not nice." "Well, Violet doesn't have that protection that you've got around your apartment, Laurel," Lewis said. I gasped. "Have you tried to get into my apartment?" Lewis had the grace to look shamefaced. "I wasn't going to spy on you, if that's what you mean. I came by earlier this morning when I saw Norbert and Violet, to tell you about them, but I couldn't get past the barrier." Ernie smirked. "A likely story," he said, crossing his arms. Lewis rounded on him. "It's true." I drank my coffee quickly and then put another pod in the machine. Clearly, it was going to be a long day. "No squabbling, you two," I said. "We have to find out who killed Lewis, so Basil won't be a suspect anymore." Lewis pouted. "Oh, yes, don't bother to solve my murder just because you care about me." I sighed. I was beginning to think that my mother would be better company. Lewis was still ranting. "Norbert did it. Norbert did it, I tell you." "You only said that after you knew he was off with your girlfriend," I pointed out. "Fiancé?" I waved my hand. "Yes, all right then, whatever. Fiancé. You didn't mention Norbert before this. Anyway, what possible motive could he have had?" "I know Norbert murdered me," Lewis said. "I should have gone to Basil with the information first." "Why didn't you?" I asked him. "Basil is your long-term friend, and you hardly know me." At that, Lewis vanished. Ernie shrugged and then vanished too. I drank my third cup of coffee in peace. I was wondering what to do next, whether to call Basil or to get back to painting, when Basil called me. My heart fluttered when I saw the caller ID. Basil wasted no time in coming to the point. "Lewis is here with me. He said that Norbert killed him." I interrupted him. "Lewis was just here. He told me the same thing." Basil paused for a moment. "You were just at Laurel's," I heard him say. After a moment, he continued speaking, this time to me. "Laurel, I didn't know that. He came here in a terrible state and said that he just caught Norbert with his fiancée in a hotel room." "Yes, I've heard all about it," I said. "He hasn't mentioned Norbert to us before. Do you think he only suspects him now because he saw him with his fiancée?" "Yes, I do," Basil said. "We did ask him if he knew anyone who wanted to kill him, and he only mentioned the embezzler. Still, do you think we should check out Norbert?" "Yes, what a good idea," I said, although I didn't think it was a good idea at all. I simply wanted to have some alone time with Basil. "What can we do, though? We can hardly go to Norbert and Violet and ask them questions. It's not as if we're the police." Ernie appeared in front of me. "I wasn't with Lewis at the hotel, so I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if the two people who have just arrived at the funeral home are Norbert and Violet." With that, he vanished again. I relayed that news to Basil. On the one hand, I was pleased that I had the opportunity to get some information from the new suspect, but on the other hand, the timing wasn't good. Basil had probably been about to ask me out to lunch. I opened the door before the doorbell had even sounded, causing the two people standing there to jump slightly. Before I could form an opinion on their appearance, I was almost knocked backwards by the smell of the fragrance. I assumed it was the woman wearing the perfume and not the man, although it had woodsy undernotes. I've heard that someone can get so used to the scent of their own perfume that they wear more and more each day, and now I believed it. "Laurel Bay," the man said. "Yes," I said, waiting for him to continue. "I'm Norbert Watson, and this is Violet Pendlebury. We'd like to speak with you about a memorial service." I kept my features carefully neutral and didn't let on that I knew what they were here about. "Please, come into my office," I said in a professional tone. When we reached my office, I opened the door and showed them in. As soon as I sat down, Norbert spoke again. "A friend of ours was killed. I believe he landed on your roof." I carefully showed surprise. "Do you mean Lewis Lowe's?" "Did you know him?" he asked me. "I only met him in passing when he was on his way to the drop zone," I said. "Such a terrible thing." "The police said they don't know how long they'll take with his body," Norbert said. "For that reason, we thought we should hold a memorial service. Violet and I have pressing business, but we've contacted everyone who would like to attend such a service, and they all said they can come at once. I know it's short notice, but do you have a vacancy for this week?" I nodded. Funerals are always at short notice. People don't usually book months in advance. Neither Norbert nor Violet showed any amusement at my statement. Both simply nodded solemnly. I made a show of looking through my appointment book and took the opportunity to look them over. Norbert was good-looking in a similar way to Lewis. Violet, on the other hand, was strikingly attractive. I could not guess her age. She could have been anything from 25 to 50. Her skin was glowing, and she had long, straight blonde hair and a slim figure. Had she been taller, she could easily have been mistaken for a supermodel. "Do you mind me asking how you knew Mr. Lowes?" Violet and Norbert exchanged glances. "We were friends," Violet said. It was the first time Violet had spoken, and although she spoke softly, her voice held the commanding presence of a drill sergeant. I pushed on. "Had you known him long?" They both nodded. "We all met at college, and the three of us have been friends ever since." That was news to me. "Do you know my accountant, Basil Sandalwood?" I asked them. "Apparently he went to college with Lewis too. He was with Lewis when, well, you know." My voice trailed away. "We don't know Mr. Sandalwood," Norbert said. "They were probably doing law or accounting classes together. Lewis also took archaeology classes, and that's how we met him." I nodded. "Oh, you're archaeologists?" They both looked aghast. "Good gracious me, no," Violet said. "We took those classes just because there were no exams." I changed the subject. "What day would you like the memorial service?" "Is tomorrow too soon?" Violet asked me. "Tomorrow?" I echoed. "Is it too soon?" Norbert said. I shook my head. "No, not for us. But is it too soon for Lewis's friends and family?" Norbert looked somewhat uncomfortable, but answered readily enough. "Lewis doesn't have any family. That is to say, he has no living relatives at all. He does have friends, though, and Violet and I have contacted all of them, and most of them can make it tomorrow. Violet and I needed to leave town as soon as possible because we have pressing business." "I bet you do," I thought cattily. I thought of all the puns I could make. I suppressed a weird urge to giggle. "Do you have anyone in mind to take the service?" I managed to say. Norbert looked blank. "Don't you organize that?" "Yes," I said. "I most certainly can. Most people use the minister from their own church, but I'll check to see if Pastor Green is available. He does non-denominational and interdenominational services." Norbert and Violet did not seem to care. "He will be fine," Violet said dismissively. We then moved to discussing prices. "We want the standard average service," Violet said. I was silent for a moment, pondering her words. What would be her motivation for saying that? Did she want the cheapest service, but didn't want to say so? I stared at her again. There was something about her that I didn't like. She didn't appear to be the sort of person that one warms to. There was something cold and forbidding about her. I wondered why she hadn't told me that she had been Lewis's fiancée. Surely that would have been the normal thing to do. I stabbed the folder in front of me. "This is the service that most people have," I said, swinging the folder around so they could both see it. "That will do fine," Norbert said. He barely even looked at the folder. Violet nodded her agreement. She fiddled with the straps of her designer purse. At that point, Lewis appeared at the side of my desk. Norbert and Violet followed my gaze. No matter, they would never suspect that I was looking at a ghost. Lewis pointed to Norbert. "He did it. He stole my fiancé, and he murdered me." At that very moment, my landline rang. Norbert and Violet stood up. "Please, sit down," I said. "I'll speak with whoever it is later." Norbert appeared pleased to have an excuse to leave. "That's okay. We have to be going anyway. We'll show ourselves out." They both hurried out the door, and I answered the phone. It was a lady wanting to book a themed funeral. "Yes, Tuesday is fine," I said, after I heard all her requirements. "Yes, Pastor Green definitely won't have a problem with doing a Wizard of Oz funeral. As I'm sure you know, we are known for our celebrity and themed funerals." "Yes," the lady on the other end of the phone said. "I saw the article about you when you did the Kiss funeral. I looked up your website and then realized you were the ideal funeral home to do the Wizard of Oz funeral." I scrawled notes on a piece of paper on which I had written Wizard of Oz and then underlined it 3 times. Under that, I wrote the names of all the Wizard of Oz characters. Pastor Green was now in the habit of dressing up for the celebrity and themed funerals, and sometimes he asked my advice as to how he should dress. I thought I heard a noise outside my office door at that point, but dismissed it. I called Janet to give her the good news that we were doing a Wizard of Oz funeral. Janet loved the themed funerals. Just then I heard another sound at the door and crept over to it. I flung it open, and there was my mother hiding on the other side of the door. "Were you listening in to what I was saying?" I asked her. "How dare you, Laurel?" she snapped at me. "I just came to see how you were, and I saw those people leave. My only daughter saying such a terrible thing about me. How could you? I'm happy that you've booked another funeral. I'm happy for you." I ran my hands through my hair. "Mum, you really have to stop being verbally abusive towards me. You should show me some support for once. All you ever do is complain about me. I know you're upset that Dad left the business to me, but instead of trying to help me, all you've done is make snide little remarks to me the whole time." I crossed my arms over my chest, expecting Mum to go into one of her rages. Instead, a calculating look passed over her face. "I'm very hurt, Laurel," she said in the voice that she always used to gain sympathy. "That voice won't work on me, Mum. You forget who you're talking to." Mum narrowed her eyes. "I will be supportive, Laurel. You'll be surprised at just how supportive I'll be." I realized she had taken my words as a challenge. Oh well, how bad could it be if she went over the top in being supportive? Surely that could only be a good thing. I left abruptly, fearful I would say something rude. I went outside to see Basil's sheep, as I always did when I needed to relax. It was good to be in the fresh air, with nature, and to be with sheep that were always nice to me, no matter what. It was only when I reached their fence that I realized I hadn't locked my office. At any rate, it was too late now. If Mum was going to snoop, then she would have already uncovered any available information. Chapter 9. By the following morning, I was quite stressed. I was in that awkward time with Basil when we weren't actually a couple, but we were almost a couple. Things would have gone more smoothly if Lewis hadn't been murdered in that in-between time. And I had been unable to speak with Basil because the police had taken him in yet again for questioning. I met Pastor Green at the door, and he looked even more stressed than I was. Pastor Green wasn't a man who normally looked stressed, and that was a miracle in itself, given that Mum and Ian were in his congregation. "Hi, Pastor Green. Please come into my office and we can go over the service. Would you like coffee?" "No thanks, Laurel. Tell me, what do you know about the deceased?" I shrugged. "Really, I don't know anything. He was a friend of Basil's, or at least he went to college with him. Haven't you spoken to Norbert and Lewis's fiancée, Violet? I gave them your number." By now we had reached my office, and I held the door open for the pastor. When we had both taken our seats, he continued. "They called me just to confirm the time, but when I asked them about Mr. Lowe's, they didn't say much at all." "Did you speak with Norbert or Violet?" I asked him. "Both of them, actually," the pastor said, raising his eyebrows. "It seems they are sharing a hotel room." "That was the impression I had, too," I said. "Neither of them could tell me anything much about Lewis. I said I needed to say something about him at the service, but they didn't seem at all interested. To tell you the truth, Laurel, this has never happened to me before. Usually people are most forthcoming about the deceased. They usually tell me all sorts of anecdotes about the person, what their life was like, and so on. I chewed the end of the pen and tried to ignore Lewis, who had materialized behind the pastor. "I told you Norbert killed me," Lewis said angrily. "He took my fiancée, and that was his motive for killing me. I told you he was always jealous of me. It was him, I tell you." His voice had risen to a high pitch. "Sorry, Pastor Green," I said. My mind just wandered. "What did you say again?" I shot Lewis a glare, hoping he would go away, but he didn't. "I said that I tried to call Basil to ask him more about Lewis, but he wasn't answering his mobile phone." I rubbed my temples. "Unfortunately, it seems Basil is the police's main, in fact only, suspect in Lewis's murder." "Oh, that's awful," Pastor Green said. Ernie materialized next to Lewis. "The two lovebirds have just arrived," he announced, earning a glare from Lewis. Just then the front door chimed. "That's probably Norbert and Violet now," I said to Pastor Green. I opened the door to see Norbert and Violet and a tall man standing next to them. He was gripping Violet's arm, presumably in a gesture of support, but she was leaning away from him. Norbert at once introduced the man as Theo Derringer. "He was the second in command to Lewis," he said. "You know, in Lewis's accounting firm." I nodded, and in turn introduced Pastor Green. I ushered them inside into the memorial room. While the four of them were making small talk, I took the opportunity to study Theo. He reminded me of a snake. He was tall and very skinny, and somewhat stooped, yet his face had a youthful quality about it. His eyes, however, darted from side to side and were small and glittering. They were an unusual amber color, amber irises surrounding tiny black pupils. The only time I had seen eyes like that before was on a deadly eastern brown snake. I just hoped he wasn't about to strike. Yet when he finally did speak, he was completely garrulous. Words gushed from him just as water had gushed from my pipes that morning when the plumber had attempted, unsuccessfully, to plumb in my bathroom. It looked like I would have to continue to use the cosmetician room facilities for a while longer. People were starting to arrive, so I slipped into my role as a hostess. Theo followed me, allegedly to assist me, but I still felt uneasy around him. He leant forward to whisper in my ear, and his words came out with a hiss like a snake. "Did you know that Lewis did not have any family?" he said. I edged away from him. "Yes, Norbert mentioned that to me yesterday." Theo made a sound that was halfway between a chuckle and the sound I imagined that someone would make if they were being strangled. "Most of the people here will be Lewis's, well, let's just call them ex-girlfriends." He sniggered, and then I remembered who he reminded me of. He looked just like a younger Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. At any rate, he was now number 3 on my suspects list. "So, Theo," I said, "you obviously knew Lewis very well, working with him." Theo nodded. "Yes, I've known him for years and years. Do you have any security here?" I was taken aback by the question. "Why? Will I need them?" My imagination ran wild. Theo rubbed his hands together. "I think there could be a catfight if Mandy Holmes turns up. She was Lewis's girlfriend before Violet Pendlebury. There's no love lost between them." I decided to be blunt. "I thought Violet was Lewis's fiancée." Theo continued to look around the room. "Yes, that's right." "Did Lewis know that she was having an affair with Norbert?" Theo turned his attention back to me. "Who knows? He wasn't a clean potato himself, if you get my meaning." I thought that over. It was as if Theo already knew that Norbert and Violet were together, but Lewis sure hadn't. What if Theo was in it with Norbert? Or, on the other hand, perhaps he was just used to this type of thing from Lewis and his long succession of girlfriends. And a long succession of girlfriends was right. There were about 20 women in the room, all of them young and beautiful, and all of them casting nasty glances at each other, and even nastier glances at Violet. Norbert and Violet were doing their best to stay at the other end of the room. Just then Basil burst through the door. He saw me at once and hurried over. "I'm so sorry I'm late, Laurel," he said. He kissed me on the cheek, and my stomach did flip-flops. "Basil, this is Theo Derringer," I managed to say. The two men shook hands. "What a terribly sad occasion," Theo said. "One never knows when they might go. Here one minute, gone the next. Why, it could happen to anyone. I bet when Lewis woke up that morning, he had no idea that he would end up dead by the end of the day." Basil and I just looked at him. Undaunted, he pushed on. "And was he staying with you, Basil?" "No, he was staying at a local hotel with his fiancée, Violet." "I didn't know that," I said with surprise. "So, Violet was in town when Lewis was killed?" Basil nodded. "Apparently so, from what the police said, albeit in a roundabout way. Norbert was also here and staying in the very same hotel." I saw Theo listening with interest, so I thought it best not to say anything more. So Lewis and Violet had come here together, and Norbert was staying in the hotel too. That gave both Violet and Norbert access to Lewis's parachute. So why hadn't the police called either of them in for questioning? A woman walked past and smiled at Theo, and then gave Basil the once-over. "How did Norbert and Violet know to contact all these ex-girlfriends?" I asked Theo. "Surely Violet didn't personally know all Lewis's conquests." "No, that was me," Theo said. "As Lewis's second-in-command, I had all the contact numbers of his girlfriends." I was surprised by that. "Surely not," I asked him. "You weren't his personal assistant." Theo's face darkened. "Lewis often treated me like one," he said, but then appeared to catch himself as he forced a smile. I looked up and saw Pastor Green trying to get my attention. "Excuse me, Theo," I said. "I think Pastor Green wants to start the service now." Theo walked down to take his seat at the front, while I took up my position at the back of the room. From there, I could keep an eye on the proceedings. "You go and have a seat, Basil," I urged him. "I'll have to stay back here." Pastor Green launched into a speech about Lewis. I wondered how he could be so creative, talking about someone he had never met. While he was used to doing so, usually the loved ones had given him a lot more to go on than Violet and Norbert had. Just then the door opened. Everyone turned to look at the late arrivals, and all looked shocked. From where I was standing, the door itself obscured my view of whoever it was, but they seemed to be creating quite a stir. As they shut the door behind them, I realized why. It was Mum. For some bizarre reason, she was wearing a brown wig with long, intricately tied braids with a blue bow and ribbons. Her dress was of blue gingham check, and her blouse had white puff sleeves. Her socks were blue, and I did a double take when I saw that her shoes were red. Now it was beginning to make sense. When Mum snooped around my office, she must have seen my notes on the Wizard of Oz funeral for the following week. That, together with her declaring that she was going to be more supportive from now on, had led to her dressing as Dorothy and attending this funeral, a funeral she had obviously confused with the Wizard of Oz funeral. I almost felt sorry for her. Ian was a whole other matter. He had a bright red studded leather collar around his neck, and he was wearing a dark grey furry dog suit, along with a black mask, complete with dog ears. I think Mum had tried to dress him as Toto, but had somehow missed the mark. The impression that he gave was not Wizard of Oz at all, and by the looks on everyone's faces, I didn't think I was the only one with that thought. It also didn't help that Mum had him on a leash, and he was crawling on his hands and knees. Chapter 10. I knew I had to get Mum away from the funeral. Bizarrely, she didn't appear to be perturbed by the fact that nobody else was dressed up. Pastor Green cleared his throat loudly, causing everyone to look back to the front. He continued the service. Mum found a seat and made herself comfortable, while Ian sat on his haunches in the aisle next to her. I shuffled over to her, trying my best not to disturb anybody too much as I shoved past them, and took a seat next to her.
"Mum," I hissed, "what are you doing?" "Be quiet, Laurel. He's giving a euphemism," Mum replied without looking at me.
Ian also maintained his direct stare at Pastor Green, and that was significantly creepier due to his outfit. I sighed. Eulogy, Mum, not euphemism. Why are you dressed like that? I was sure I knew the answer, but I wanted her to reach the conclusion on her own. If I flat out told her that this wasn't the Wizard of Oz funeral, she'd find some way to turn it against me. I could imagine it vividly. "Oh, Laurel, you're so paranoid. I had no idea about a Wizard of Oz funeral. I can't believe you'd accuse me of snooping around your office." I considered for a moment that having an argument with her might be less embarrassing than just having them around, although I quickly realized that drawing attention to myself in their presence was the last thing I wanted or needed.
"Because I'm at a funeral, Laurel. Please be quiet. You're acting very strangely."
Mum said this with such a straight face that for a brief moment I felt like I was the insane one. That feeling passed when I noticed she was still gripping Ian's leash. We sat in the most awkward silence of my life for several minutes until Pastor Green was done. I found myself marveling at his ability to keep a straight face and continue speaking normally, especially given that more than half the crowd kept turning around to stare at my mother and Ian. I considered walking away several times, but didn't want to have to push past anybody and draw more attention to myself. I'd spent the better part of the eulogy thinking up ways to get Mum out of the funeral, but had drawn nothing but blanks. I thought that perhaps it was best simply to leave her there to enjoy the funeral. After all, was she really hurting anyone? I sighed when I realized that leaving Mum with Ian on a leash was potentially the least damaging thing I could do. The speeches didn't take long to wrap up. Pastor Green's had been by far the best of the bunch, and the others, from a handful of ex-girlfriends, had been passive-aggressive at best, borderline violent at worst. Each had focused on her own relationship with Lewis and how much better hers was than anybody else's. Frankly, it was awful to listen to, but it also made me sad. Nobody seemed to know Lewis well, except perhaps on a shallow level. If I hadn't known him better, I'd have felt sorry for him. At the moment, though, I had bigger problems. Mum was still wearing her ridiculous get-up, which would not be so bad had she not insisted on bringing Ian on a leash. To my dismay, I found her approaching a small group of guests and striking up a conversation. I considered how quickly I could run out of the room and how much it would damage my social and professional standing if I were to be seen sprinting away into the sunset. I figured that, unfortunately, it would probably do more damage than simply being the woman who handled the crazy stranger with a man on a leash. I approached my mother, listening to the conversation she was having, and looking for my chance to jump in and get her to leave.
"And might I ask why you have a man on a leash?"
a woman asked Mum. It was a perfectly reasonable question, albeit one nobody should ever have to ask.
"Oh, he's not a man, he's my pet."
Mum made the unfortunate decision to wink as she said it, and for a brief moment I thought the woman she was talking to might throw up. "Excuse me, Thelma," I said as I approached, desperate to save the poor stranger. I decided to bite the bullet and just tell her the truth. "This isn't the Wizard of Oz-themed funeral. That one's next week." Mum looked at me like I'd just told her a nuclear missile was headed straight for us. Her eyes widened, and Ian looked like he was about to pass out.
"Of course, I know that," she said, struggling to maintain an even smile. Now, please excuse us. I left the oven on and Ian needs to help me turn it off.
I didn't know my mother could move so fast, especially with Ian on a leash running on his hands and knees. They vanished from sight before I could blink. I looked back to see Pastor Green giving me a thumbs up from the crowd of people, and I smiled back. I had at least helped make Lewis's funeral a little less depressing, but being here was making Lewis's death feel more real. Seeing him as a ghost had made me feel as though he'd never really died, but seeing these people mourn, or rather not mourn, made me feel sorry for Lewis. It also made me sorrier for Basil, who was the prime suspect. I had to get to the bottom of Lewis's murder, and soon. I crossed over to the door to shut it, but the two detectives burst into the room. I opened my mouth to speak to them, but they bypassed me, and to my horror, headed straight for Basil. As they led Basil past me, he stopped to tell me not to worry, and then he was gone. I turned my attention to the food. Pastor Green was already steering people to the room where we always served tea, coffee, and finger food after a service. As usual, I had prepared it before the service. I was worrying about Basil. Why would they question him, let him go, and then take him in again for questioning? It made no sense. I was surprised to see Mum return. I expected she would have been embarrassed, but there she was as large as life, yet without Ian. I was talking to Norbert and Violet, so I introduced Mum when she came over. I hoped they wouldn't connect her with the woman in fancy dress from earlier. Mum was delighted to find out that Violet had been Lewis's fiancé.
What a lovely man he was,
Mum said. She reached for Violet's hand and patted it. I could see Violet wanted to snatch it back.
At least you have the blessed assurance that Lewis is up there now.
She pointed at the ceiling. Norbert appeared to be confused. What do you mean? In a plane? My mother laughed.
Goodness gracious, no. Up there in heaven with God, like all other righteous before him.
I took Mum's arm in an attempt to steer her away from them, but she resisted.
Isn't it wonderful to have the assurance that you're going to heaven, rather than to know you will suffer eternal damnation in hell for your sins?
Norbert made a horrible strangling sound and then excused himself. Violet looked somewhat uncomfortable. Norbert had a difficult childhood, she explained. His parents were in a very strict church where they always preached fire and brimstone. It's left emotional scars. With that, she hurried over to comfort Norbert.
That was most confusing, my mother said, turning to me. Why would preaching fire and brimstone give anyone emotional scars? It's exactly what they need.
Before I could stop her, she hurried over to Norbert and was soon loudly informing him of that fact. I hurried over to rescue him, but just as I reached them, Violet excused herself. We have to go to the reading of Lewis's will later today. Mum hurried after them, offering to lend them a copy of a sermon entitled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Chapter 11. That night I woke up several times and checked my phone. I had texted Basil to ask him to send me a text when the police released him, even if it was the middle of the night. I awoke at dawn and immediately snatched up my phone. There was no word from Basil. I forced myself to have a shower downstairs and make myself look presentable before I made coffee. On the off chance that Basil were to arrive without warning, I didn't want him to see what I looked like first thing in the morning, pre-caffeine. After my first cup of coffee, he still hadn't called. I stared at the phone once more, willing it to ring. I had just given up and had decided to take my mind off it by painting when the doorbell rang. To my relief, it was Basil. He looked white and drawn. He hadn't shaven, his hair was sticking out in all directions, and he looked a good 10 years older. "Are you all right?" I said. Before he had time to speak, I added, "Come in and have some coffee." The machine was still on, so I dropped in a pod. "I've been so worried about you. I had no idea what had happened." Basil looked puzzled. I texted you and told you all about it. I got worried when you didn't reply, so I came over to check on you." I looked at my phone. No, there are no texts. Basil pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through it. "Oh, no. I'm so sorry. I did write a text, but it didn't send." He held out his phone to show me. "I hate it when that happens," I said. "But did they arrest you? What happened?" "They didn't arrest me, but I had to get a lawyer. I didn't get out of there until 3 in the morning." "But why? What makes them think you did it?" Basil had been standing, leaning back against the bench top, but now he sat down on a seat and put his head in his hands. "Laurel, I'm Lewis's main heir." "What?" I gasped. "You're kidding." Basil shook his head. "I wish I were." "But why you?" I asked him. "I thought you'd hardly seen him since college." Basil waved his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "I don't have a clue. I've inherited his accounting firm." "But would anyone murder someone if their only motive was that they inherited an accounting firm?" I said, scratching my head. "And a whole lot of money with that," Basil said, looking somewhat embarrassed. "It turns out that Lewis was a millionaire." I took a while to process the information. "Did you know he was a millionaire?" Basil shrugged. "He was always splashing his money around. I don't think he ever said he was a millionaire, though. He just said that his parents were very wealthy. Anyway, where is he?" "Actually, I haven't seen him since the morning of the memorial service," I admitted. "Next time Ernie shows up, I'll ask him to go and find Lewis." Basil looked grim. "Anyway, I'm telling you all this out of chronological order. The police took me down to the station to question me. The detectives, that is. And then they escorted me to the reading of the will." "So Violet was right. There's already been the will reading. I didn't think it would be so soon." Basil nodded. "All the beneficiaries were there, and as the memorial service was being held in town, apparently Lewis's lawyer decided to hold the will reading there." "Is that usual?" I asked him. "No idea." Basil finished his coffee before continuing. "Norbert and Violet looked absolutely furious. They were livid with rage. If the police hadn't been there would have been some yelling at the very least. They looked like they wanted to murder me on the spot." "You're kidding." Basil shook his head. "Norbert and Violet were protesting throughout the will reading, and as soon as it was over, the detectives hurried me out of there and back to the station for more questioning. So you can see that I do have a motive. I was the major beneficiary of the will, and I went skydiving with him. I had access to his parachute. It's an open and shut case." I thought for a moment. "No, if it was an open and shut case, they would have already arrested you." "I hope you're right. That's what my lawyer says too. They didn't find any riser threads on any of my clothes, and the touch DNA samples didn't come back with any of my DNA. They took all the scissors from my house, but they didn't find any riser threads on those either." "What, they searched your house?" "Yes, they had a warrant." "This is all too much." I shook my head, frustrated. "But doesn't that mean they figured out that you didn't do it?" "No, sad to say. It just means that they think I wore gloves. But the good news is that although it doesn't prove I didn't do it, it doesn't prove that I did do it either." I rubbed the back of my neck. "What happens now?" Basil frowned. "There's nothing we can do. The police will make of the evidence what they will, and there's nothing I can do about it." "But there is something we can do about it," I said. "We can find out who the murderer is and somehow get that evidence to the police. Ernie, Lewis, are you there?" "Hello?" A loud voice rang out. Basil and I exchanged glances, and then I realized that the voice belonged to a human being, a live human being. "Oh, I forgot. It's the plumber." I hurried to the door and let the plumber in. Basil had followed me out. I turned to him. "I'll just go and show Tom to the bathroom." "I'd better be going," Basil said. "When I got back last night, I fell asleep on the sofa. I need a shave and to get cleaned up, and then I need to speak to my lawyer." Tom looked Basil up and down. "It must be awful being a murder suspect. I heard you got home in the middle of the night."
"How did you know?" I asked him. Tom laughed.
"Everyone knows everyone else's business in this town."
I had to agree that he was right. "Basil, would you like to come back for lunch?" Basil said that would be lovely, and I noticed a glint in Tom's eyes. No doubt that, too, would soon be all over town. On a brighter note, the plumbing news wasn't anywhere near as bad as I feared.
"I'll have it up and running in no time," Tom said, wielding a wrench. "Someone's already done all the work, and their only mistake was that part that caused the flooding earlier. It won't take much to get it all working. I wonder why they didn't finish it when they had come so close."
I shrugged. "No idea. Would you have time to look at the kitchen as well, please?" I didn't know if my luck would continue to the kitchen, but it did. Tom informed me that the kitchen was all right to go. He only had to turn on a tap inside a cupboard. I stayed in the kitchen while Tom went back to wrestle with the bathroom. I had diverted all my calls from my landline to my mobile phone, so I checked that the volume was high. I looked in my refrigerator, but it was only stocked with the bare emergency essentials: chocolate, wine, and ice cream. I didn't know how Basil would feel about those items for lunch, despite the fact that they looked awfully good to me. I had a couple of hours before Basil returned, and there were no bookings for the day, so I threw myself into cleaning up my apartment. I opened the windows to let in the fresh air, but only succeeded in letting in the flies. I lit some incense and put a stick in each room, smiling as I did. Mum had not allowed me to burn incense in her house. She always said that incense was evil and New Age. Now that the water was running in the kitchen, I decided to clean it. The kitchen really needed replacing, but it would do for now. The bench tops were old and yellow, and the cabinet doors were some sort of horrible timber veneer. I figured I would paint everything white, and it could stay like that until I could afford to have the whole thing replaced. The kitchen had never been used, so at least I didn't have to clean up anyone else's years of dirt and grime. I had bought a charity store find table for $5 when I had first decided to move into the apartment, and I had put it here. I had already chalk painted the legs in white and dry brushed the top. It looked quite attractive, and while I didn't have any nice chairs for the table, I did have 3 old metal chairs that I had bought for a bargain. They were awfully uncomfortable and not very attractive, but they sure beat sitting on the floor. After I cleaned the kitchen, I debated whether to start painting, but I wanted to have a nice lunch with Basil in my apartment and didn't want the paint fumes to be overwhelming. I looked at the time and realized I had taken longer than I thought. I grabbed my keys, told Tom I wouldn't be long, and headed out to town. I went to my favorite Chinese restaurant, which happened to be the only one in town, and bought a selection of food. I realized how little I knew about Basil when I realized I had no idea of his food preferences. By the time I got back to the funeral home, Tom was just leaving. He handed me his statement. I looked at it and smiled. It was quite affordable. "Just put it into my bank by bank transfer," Tom said. "I've got my account details on the statement." "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. I'll go and transfer the money now." Just then Basil's car drove up, and Tom winked at me. "No hurry, Laurel. I know where you live." He chuckled and went to his vehicle. Basil looked a lot better than he had. I wondered if he'd had time to have a little sleep as well. "That smells good," he said. "Hungry?" "I'm ravenous," he admitted. I held up the bags. "I hope you like Chinese." "I love Chinese." I smiled and turned around and ran straight into Lewis. To be accurate, I walked straight through Lewis. It was an unpleasant feeling, somewhat akin to walking through a veil of water. "Where have you been, Lewis?" I asked him. "Why didn't you tell me that I was the major beneficiary in your will?" Basil asked him. "Well, excuse me," Lewis said sarcastically. "A little thing like being murdered happened to me. Forgive me if I can't remember everything."
I hoped Lewis wasn't going to ruin our lunch, and I wondered how I could give him a hint to leave. But just then, a car approached the funeral home at great speed. Chapter 12. Violet and Norbert jumped out of the car, which had come to a halt with a squeal of brakes. "I thought I'd find you here, Basil," Violet said icily. "Why don't you come clean and tell me how you convinced Lewis to change his will?" Basil's expression seemed to change from surprise to anger to frustration. I had no idea I was even in Lewis's will. Violet stomped her foot, just like a 2-year-old child throwing a tantrum. "Tell us, how did you convince Lewis to change his will?" Norbert asked him. His tone was controlled, but it was clear that he was just as angry as Violet. Basil crossed his arms. "I've told you, I had no idea I was in the will, let alone that I was the major beneficiary." Violet made a strangled sound. "Lewis told me that if we got engaged, he would change his will and I would be the sole heir." "Quite obviously he didn't get around to it," Basil said, "but Lewis never so much as mentioned the will to me." "After we were engaged, Lewis told me that he'd already changed it and that I'd get everything," Violet snapped. Norbert chipped in. "Yes, that's right. Violet told me back then." "So you and Violet were in very close touch at that time, were you?" I said. Both Violet and Norbert turned their attention to me as the implication of my words sank in. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Bay, but Violet and I are only friends," Norbert said coolly. I knew that wasn't true, because Lewis, in ghost form, had seen the two of them being so not just friends. Violet continued with her tirade. "You talked him out of it somehow, and I'd like to know how." Norbert took her by the arm. "Come on, Violet. He's not going to tell you." Violet narrowed her eyes once more. "I'm contesting the will. I'll see you in court." They departed with the smell of burning rubber. I was a bit shaken after the encounter. Basil and I walked into my apartment, and I placed the Chinese food on the dining room table in the middle of the kitchen. "I can't believe how much you've done in here in such a short space of time." Basil looked around the room with obvious admiration. "I have to replace the whole kitchen, but this will do in the meantime. After I paint the rest of the house, I'm going to paint everything in here white. Then it won't be so hard to live with until I can afford to replace it." I always ramble when I'm nervous, and I was always nervous around Basil. I fetched some of my plates from a cardboard box and placed them on the table. "I haven't really unpacked yet," I told him. "I want to get the apartment painted first." "How did things go with the plumber?" Basil asked me. I smiled. "It went really well, much better than I expected. I thought I'd have a huge plumbing bill, but it was much less than I thought. Tom said most of the work had been done already." I didn't know if Basil was truly interested in the plumber, or whether he was trying to be polite and making conversation. Although he was clean-shaven and rested now, there was an undeniable air of fatigue around him. "Don't worry, Basil," I added. "I'm sure the police will find the murderer soon." Basil shook his head. "I don't know about that. My lawyer said they seem pretty sure it's me. I really don't think they're looking elsewhere. They're just looking for evidence to pin it on me." I could feel a headache coming on, and I rubbed my temples. It was a sudden, nasty headache with pressure behind my eyes and at the bridge of my nose. I supposed it was a tension headache. We ate in companionable silence for a few moments until Basil spoke. "This is really good of you, Laurel. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it." He laid his hand over mine, and my knees trembled. The touching moment was broken by a man's voice yelling my name at my apartment door. We both jumped. "Who on earth is it?" Basil said. "I think it's Lewis." I stood up. "Why didn't he just come in?" Basil asked me. "I thought ghosts could walk through walls." "They can, as a rule," I said, "but I have red brick dust and black salt all around the perimeter of this apartment, and I also have it warded in order to keep ghosts out." I do want my privacy." Basil appeared to be thinking it over, but once again Lewis screeched out my name. "I'd better go and see what he wants," I said. I opened the door to find an agitated Lewis floating there. "Can you please land, Lewis?" I asked him. "Floating makes me nervous." "Why?" I shrugged. "I just find it creepy." Lewis looked at me as if he were about to say something cutting, but changed his mind. He looked over my shoulder at Basil. "Hey, mate, I'm glad you're here. I've been hanging around at the police station, and they're sure you murdered me." Basil sighed. "I didn't murder you, truly." Lewis held up his hands. "I know that. It wasn't an accusation. I'm just coming to tell you that the police don't have any other suspects. They're not looking into anyone else." "That's what Basil and I were just saying," I told him. "They haven't mentioned any other suspects at all?" Lewis shook his head. "I don't think they're really looking. Those detectives seem in a hurry to wrap things up." I looked at Basil and was worried to see that his complexion had turned ashen. I also saw for the first time that he had deep, dark circles under his eyes. "Who do you think murdered you, Lewis?" Basil asked him. "I've told you 100 times," he exclaimed. "It was Norbert. He murdered me to get my girlfriend." I shook my head. "That doesn't seem a really good motive, Lewis. Could he have a motive other than that?" "I have to agree with Laurel," Basil said. "Anyway, we don't want to be like the police and look at just the one suspect. Can you think of anyone else who might have wanted to kill you? What about Violet?" Lewis was visibly taken aback. "Violet? No, she'd never hurt me. We were in love." I didn't know whether to point out that Violet had taken up with Norbert what seemed like only minutes after Lewis was killed, so I would hardly think she was in love, but I thought it better not to point that out. Basil appeared to be thinking the same thing, because he didn't mention it either. Basil was the first to speak. "Who else could there have been? Think hard, Lewis." "Well, there was that other accounting firm, of course," Lewis said. "You know, I've already told you about them. It's a cruel world. The accounting firm where someone was embezzling from the trust fund. I called Simon Smarts, the head guy, the night before I came here to tell him that I'd found evidence of embezzlement. The timing works out, so he could be a suspect, although I know for a fact that Norbert did it." He crossed his arms over his chest and pulled a petulant face. "Is that another joke?" I asked him. Lewis looked puzzled. "Is what a joke?" "Simon Smarts. Is that really his name?" "Yes." I shrugged. "Okay." Ernie materialized beside Lewis. "Accounting jokes, did I hear you say?" "No," I said emphatically. Ernie smirked. "Welcome to the accounting meeting, where everybody counts." Lewis, Basil, and I groaned in unison. Lewis vanished, followed by Ernie, while I shut the door and then turned to Basil. "Let's go and eat any food that isn't cold, and make a list of suspects." I had resigned myself to the realization that my relationship with Basil couldn't progress until after this murder was solved. After all, that was the priority. "I'm sorry, Laurel," Basil said once we reached the table. "Sorry for what?" "I just wanted to have a nice lunch with you, but the murder investigation is getting in the way." I nodded. I had only just thought that, and I didn't have the words to say. Instead, I said, "True. Who are our suspects?" "Well, there's Simon Smarts from It's a Cruel World. He'd have to be the main suspect, given the timing." "I'm surprised the detectives aren't looking into him," I said. "After all, Lewis told Simon Smarts about the embezzlement the very night before he was murdered." Basil tapped his pen against his chin. "You know, I bet the police don't know that. Lewis only told us that after he was already a ghost, so who was there to tell the police?" "Theo Derringer," I exclaimed. He was Lewis's right-hand man, so he must have known that Lewis was auditing the firm, even if he didn't know that Lewis had just uncovered the evidence of embezzlement. "Good thinking, Laurel," Basil said. He smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen in days. "Let's go and ask Theo some questions before he leaves town." I agreed. "Let's go over the other suspects too. I'll add Theo to the list. Just because we don't know what motives he had doesn't mean he didn't have a motive. Besides, maybe he thought that Lewis would leave the business to him. There could be any number of reasons." "And there's Norbert and Violet too," Basil said. "Violet certainly had a motive, because she thought she was inheriting everything, and Lewis was a millionaire. Plus Norbert could have been in it with her. It's mighty suspicious how they hooked up together right after Lewis's death." "There's one thing that puzzles me with Violet being a suspect. Surely she could have waited to kill him until after she was married to him. Then she'd inherit for sure." Basil tapped his chin again. "Yes, that's a good point. We need to look into them all. And we'll start with Theo Derringer," I said. Chapter 13. The day was unseasonably hot by the time Basil and I reached the cafe where Theo had agreed to meet us. Thankfully, he didn't ask us who had given us his phone number. It would have been hard to explain that it was his old boss, who was now a ghost. I had been relieved to hear that the police had asked Theo, Norbert, and Violet to stay in town to help them with their inquiries. Basil had not been so pleased. He figured the only reason was that the police wanted to extract some evidence against him from one or all of them. Basil and I walked down the sidewalk, and I watched idly as mirages, little puddles of water, appeared in front of me and then vanished just as quickly as they had appeared. The air was still, making the heat even more unbearable. We had suggested Theo meet us in one of the cafes that had alfresco dining. Basil said that none of the cafes in town had air conditioning, due to the fact that it was never really this hot, so at least we had the hope of catching a breeze if we sat outside. The alfresco area was, in fact, cooler, with a cover of sorts and plenty of flowers and shrubs, which gave the impression that it was not as hot as it was. I ordered an icy drink, and Theo and Basil followed suit. Theo wasted no time in coming to the point. "So, what did you want to see me about?" Basil and I exchanged a quick look. "As you know," Basil began, "I have inherited Lewis's business." Theo interrupted him. "Do you know what you're going to do with that yet?" Basil shook his head. "No, I'm afraid that's not my priority at the moment. I have to wait until the police find and arrest Lewis's murderer." Theo plastered what I took to be a fake look of sadness on his face, but maybe I was just too suspicious. "Oh, yes, of course," he said. "The lawyer has already given me some of Lewis's papers," Basil said, and I noticed that Theo's expression suddenly became most attentive. Basil continued. "I see that Lewis was auditing a firm by the name of It's a Cruel World. The principal is Simon Smarts." Theo nodded vigorously and then sipped his drink. He remained silent and averted his eyes from Basil's. "Were you working on that, assisting Lewis?" Basil asked him. Theo shifted in his seat and then wrung his hands. He looked more like Mr. Burns than ever. "Yes, I was." "And did Lewis tell you that he uncovered evidence of embezzlement?" Theo's eyes widened. "Are you sure that he did?" "Positive," Basil said. I was watching Theo carefully. He seemed to be acting guilty, but then he always had that look about him. "Are you absolutely sure?" Theo asked again. Basil nodded. "Yes, it's certain. Someone in that firm was embezzling a lot of money. Do you have any idea who it would be?" Theo shook his head and again avoided looking at either of us. "No, I don't have a clue. I'm awfully shocked. There must be some mistake. Could it be Simon Smarts?" Theo met Basil's eyes. His eyes darted from side to side. He reminded me once more of a snake, and I wouldn't have been surprised if his tongue had flicked in and out. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Could Simon Smarts have been the embezzler?" Basil asked. For a moment, I thought Theo was going to make a run for it. He was certainly acting furtively. "No, I'm sure Simon has nothing to do with it. He would be just as shocked as I am." "Well, if you happen to speak to him, please don't mention it to him," Basil said. Of course, whatever you say." Theo's manner was at once obsequious. "Do you have any evidence as to who the embezzler was?" I looked at Basil to see what he would say. "I haven't had a chance to look through all the paperwork yet," Basil said simply. Theo made a show of looking at his watch. "Oh, look, is that the time? I must be going." He left his drink unfinished and hurried out the door with a backwards glance over his shoulder. "He sure seems guilty," I said to Basil. Basil agreed. "He could be guilty about something else entirely, other than the murder, I mean." "And where could he possibly be going?" "Anywhere away from here," Basil said with a laugh. I smiled. "The lawyer didn't really give you any papers, did he?" "Actually, he did," Basil said, "although I couldn't see anything of interest, and certainly nothing about the embezzling with the short time I've had to go through it all. Anyway, I've cancelled my appointments for the week and given Mrs. Anise the time off. Would you like to come back to my office and help me look through the paperwork? We might uncover something." "I'd love to." I knew that being asked to see his paperwork was not the same as being asked to see his etchings. Still, I was happy to look through boring paperwork, anything that could help solve Lewis's murder and prove Basil's innocence. When Basil opened the door to his building, I was instantly hit with a blast of cool air. "Oh, it's lovely and cool in here." "That's because it's an old stone building," Basil said. "Natural insulation. My office isn't so good due to the big north-facing windows, but I do have air conditioning and heating." "It's a pity that the cafes in town don't have air conditioning," I said. "That's because most of them only have heating," Basil said. "It's never usually this hot, and it doesn't help that it hasn't rained for weeks. This is usually the month when we get the most rain." "It certainly is dry around here." Basil followed my gaze to the large potted plant in the waiting room. "I'd better water it," he said. He had just finished watering it when a man hurried into the office. "I'm sorry," Basil said. "I've just popped into the office, but we're closed for the week." "Are you Basil Sandalwood?" the man said by way of reply. I looked him over. He was dressed in a tight suit and looked uncomfortable. His face was bright red, and the top of his bald head reflected the fluorescent light. He smelt overpoweringly of aftershave. I guessed Old Spice or a grandfatherly aftershave like that. "I'm Simon Smarts of It's a Cruel World," he announced. "I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." Basil looked at me and raised his eyebrows. "Sure," he said to the man. "Please come into my office." Basil motioned to me to follow them in. The man appeared to be uncomfortable with that. "Mr. Sandalwood, I'd like to have a word with you in private, if that's all right." "Mr. Smarts, this is my assistant accountant, Laurel Bay. I have no secrets from her in this firm." The man looked flustered. "Sure, that's fine." I was even more flustered than Simon Smarts looked. I sure hoped he didn't expect me to do any addition, or then he would soon find out that I was mathematically challenged. A 6-year-old child would be better at addition than I was. Simon Smarts and I sat down while Basil turned on the air conditioning. I fervently hoped he turned it to maximum. He walked over and took his seat opposite us. "What can I do for you, Mr. Smarts?" "Please call me Simon," the man said. He had that slick air that some salespersons have. "Theo Derringer told me that you have inherited Lewis Lowe's accounting firm." "That is correct," Basil said slowly. I could see that Basil was being careful and was wondering what was coming next, as was I. "Have you decided what you are doing with Lewis's business yet?" Simon asked. "Will you be selling it?" Basil shook his head. "It's entirely too soon to make such an important decision," he said evenly. I understand, Simon said hurriedly. "I would, however, like to make you a good offer for the business." Basil shot me a look. I figured he was thinking the same thing that I was, that Simon wanted to buy Lewis's firm so he could bury the evidence of embezzlement. Was I in the same room as Lewis's murderer? A tremor ran through me at the thought. Simon appeared uncomfortable that Basil hadn't yet answered. "Would you be interested in selling the business?" he asked him. Basil was silent for a few moments. "Quite possibly," he said after an interval. Simon's face remained a mask. I expected he would have made a good poker player. "Here's my card. Let me know what figure you'd like for it, and we can talk." He stood up, and so did Basil and I. The three of us shook hands. Simon's handshake was limp, and his hand was clammy. He looked at me with rheumy eyes, and then took his leave. Basil and I followed Simon out, and Basil locked the door behind him. He turned to me. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" "Yes," I said. "Simon Smarts wants to buy Lewis's firm from you to cover up the evidence of embezzling. We have to go to the police with this." "But that doesn't mean that he's the murderer," Basil pointed out. "No, it doesn't," I agreed, "but the police at least need to know about it. It's a valuable piece of evidence. You know, he and Theo might be in it together." Basil ran his hands through his hair. "Unless we can find something in the paperwork, some evidence of embezzlement to show the police, then we can't go to them. We can't exactly tell them that the ghost of Lewis Lowes told us he had uncovered evidence of embezzlement the night before he was killed." I thought about it for a minute. "Okay, I think I know the solution. There will be evidence of embezzlement, won't there, right?" Basil nodded. "Yes, but I might not be able to get my hands on it until after probate. By then, I could well and truly be awaiting trial for murder." I held up a finger. "Hear me out. You could tell the police that Lewis told you about Simon Smarts's firm the day that he was killed. It's not a lie as such. Lewis did tell us that he uncovered the evidence about the firm. It's only that he did it in his ghost form. The police won't believe that, so you have to get the information to them from some other angle. Let's go and tell them that Simon Smarts has just made you an offer for the business. I was a witness to it. And then you can say that Lewis told you about the embezzlement before he was killed, rather than after." Basil took me by the shoulders, and electric tingles ran right through my body. "Laurel, you're a genius," he said, and then he kissed me hard. Chapter 14. Basil and I were sitting in the police station's waiting room. The station was in the next town, which was considerably bigger than Witch Woods and only a half-hour drive away. I was starting to think this was all a bad idea. We had been waiting there for ages, and I wondered if this was a ploy by the detectives to make us feel uneasy. Perhaps they thought they'd get more out of us that way. The seats themselves were comfortable enough, black vinyl, and pushed against a cream wall. In fact, every wall I could see was a different shade of cream. Even the floor tiles were cream, in vinyl squares. The ceiling did not look to be in terribly good condition, and the fluorescent lights beat down upon us, several of them flickering and threatening to give me a headache. Finally, Detective Brand came out and said, or rather grunted, that we were to follow him into an office. Detective Brand took his seat at a large but old wooden desk that looked like a government issue from the 1950s. Detective Swan leant against a window, underneath crooked and aged grey Venetian blinds that had seen better days. There was a modern desktop computer on the desk, but everything else appeared to have been caught in a time warp. There was a government-issue wooden bookcase and 2 cream filing cabinets with their doors hanging half open. Files were tossed haphazardly on top, along with a vintage fan. I figured that could bring some money on eBay. Behind the fan were various certificates and 3 wooden shields. I was too far away to read the inscriptions. The smell of stale cigarette smoke hung in the air, although I did not see any ashtrays. Perhaps it clung to the clothes of the detectives themselves. Detective Brand was scribbling furiously on a notepad in front of him, and Detective Swan was just looking at it, so I continued to look around the room. The floor was mainly olive green, with black and white running through it in rivulets, and there were red squares placed at random. The walls here, too, were cream, though there was a strange navy blue stripe about 8 inches wide along the perimeter of the floor. Bizarrely, there was an old framed photo of someone sitting on a horse hanging on the wall to our right. Finally, Detective Brand looked up. "The desk sergeant said you had some information for us." The way he said it made it sound like an accusation. Basil looked him straight in the eye. "As you know, Lewis stayed in my house the night before we went skydiving. He told me that he was auditing an accounting firm and that he had just uncovered evidence of embezzlement. Just before he drove to Witch Woods, he had called the principal of the firm, Simon Smarts, and told him." "Why didn't you tell us this before?" Detective Swan said. "I didn't think anything of it at the time," Basil said. "But today, Simon Smarts came to my office and offered to buy Lewis's firm from me. I think he was only doing that so he could bury the evidence of embezzlement." Detective Brand raised his eyebrows but didn't say anything. Basil continued. "Lewis told me that he suspected that Simon Smarts was involved in the embezzling." "Do you have any proof of that?" Brand asked him. "Not yet," Basil said, "but after probate I'll be able to get my hands on all the documents, and the evidence of the embezzling will no doubt be there." Detectives Brand and Swan looked at each other and then looked at me. "And what is your business in this?" Brand asked me. "I was at Basil's office when Simon Smarts came and made an offer to buy Lewis's business from Basil," I said evenly. I felt guilty, although I had no idea why. Perhaps it was my surroundings. "What's the name of this accounting firm?" Brand said. "It's a cruel world," Basil said. "What?" Brand said, and then he chuckled. "How do you spell it?" "I'll write it for you," Basil said. He was clearly frustrated. He wrote on a piece of paper and then pushed the paper over to Brand. Swan leant over Brand's shoulder and sniggered. "I didn't know accountants had a sense of humour." Basil shrugged, but I could tell he was irritated. I had no idea if they were taking our information seriously. I expect they thought that Basil was trying to push the suspicion onto someone else. "Look, I know you think it was me," Basil said. "It wasn't me, but I don't expect you to believe it. At least I hope you will follow up on this lead." "We'll do what we have to do, and we won't discuss it with anyone," Brand said firmly, with a tone that bordered on rude. "Do you have any other information for us?" Basil shook his head. "Just what we've just told you. The night before he was murdered, Lewis told Simon Smarts that he had uncovered evidence of embezzlement in his firm. Lewis told me that he suspected Simon. Also, Simon didn't go to Lewis's memorial service, but he came all the way to Witch Woods today just to make me an offer on Lewis's firm." Detective Brand stood up. "Thanks for the information. We'll look into it." And with that, we were dismissed. When we got outside, I put my hand on Basil's arm. "Don't worry, I think they did take it seriously, even though they didn't want to let on." I expected Basil to disagree, but to my surprise he did not. "You know, they were treating me differently in there, and I don't think it was just because you were with me. Maybe they now suspect someone else." He sighed. "I hope that's not just wishful thinking on my part." I suspected it was just wishful thinking. I had only made that comment to make Basil feel better. It seemed to me that the detectives had Basil firmly in their sights. "I'll take you home," Basil said, opening his car door for me. The ride home was spent in silence. I wondered if Basil would come in and hoped it wouldn't be awkward. However, Lewis solved the dilemma for me. He was standing outside the entrance to the funeral home, waving his arms at us. It was quite unnecessary. Who would overlook a ghost? Basil and I wasted no time hurrying over to him. "What is it?" Basil asked him. "I have some urgent news. I wanted to tell you what I overheard at the police station, but I didn't want to appear to you in front of the detectives in case you stared at me and they thought you were insane. Also, I didn't want to appear in the car in case you ran off the road." Basil was clearly growing impatient. "Well, what is it, Lewis?" "I've spent the last couple of hours following the detectives around, listening in to what they were saying." "They no longer think it was me," Basil said hopefully. I held my breath, waiting for Lewis's answer. "Oh, they think it was you, all right," Lewis said almost gleefully, "but they are looking at all the other suspects." "Well, that's good, I suppose," I added lamely. Basil shot me a half smile and then addressed Lewis. "Do you have any specific news, or did you just come to tell us that they were looking at the other suspects?" Lewis shifted from one foot to the other and then floated upward. He shot me a look and then landed. "No, I found out something really significant." "What is it?" Basil was obviously exasperated. "It's about Violet," Lewis said. "They were talking about her as a serious suspect." "Why?" Basil interrupted him. "I'm getting to that if you'll give me a chance to tell you," Lewis said with a scowl. "Violet was previously married, and to a multimillionaire. When he died, she inherited everything, apart from a summer house that he gave to his aunt." I thought that over. "So is Violet a millionaire now?" Lewis nodded. "And did you know that?" I asked him. Lewis shook his head forcefully. "No, I didn't have a clue. I knew she was very well off, but I didn't have any idea of her full financial status. I knew Norbert and Violet from my college days, and then we lost touch for some years. I did say we should sign a prenup before we were married, and she agreed. I did think at the time that she agreed a bit too readily, and she also said that she was going to insist upon one anyway. I just assumed I had more money than she did, so I thought it all very strange." "That's not all you didn't know about her, if you don't mind me saying so, Lewis," Basil said. Lewis's face changed from a ghostly white to a ghostly red. "You mean her affair with Norbert?" Basil nodded. "I bet Norbert's just after her money." "That's exactly what I was thinking," I said. Lewis looked offended. "But she's awfully good-looking, you know." Basil and I exchanged glances. "At least you know she wasn't after you for your money," I said, hoping that would cheer him up. He did look brighter, but then Basil put his foot in it. "Perhaps she was a hoarder, a money hoarder. Lewis was a millionaire too. Laurel, just because you and I aren't millionaires, we think having $1 million would make someone financially happy forever. But obviously that's not the way that Violet thought. It seems she was after every cent that she could get. Look at the awful fuss that she made when she found out that she didn't inherit anything from Lewis." "But you are a millionaire now, Basil," I pointed out. An awkward silence fell over us, until Lewis broke it. "Anyway, there's more," he said in a serious voice. We both looked at him expectantly. "Remember I said that Violet inherited the money from her first husband? Well, I presume he was her only husband." He paused, and I wished he would just come out and tell us the information. "Her first husband died," he continued. Basil's face was growing red, and I could understand why he was losing patience with Lewis. "Just tell us, Lewis," Basil snapped. I could see then that Lewis was embarrassed, and that was the reason he was reluctant to tell us. "Violet's first husband was killed." "Do you mean murdered?" I asked him. Lewis held up his hands. "Who knows? I didn't even know that she had a husband." "Didn't you hear the detectives discuss it?" Basil asked him. "Yes, of course I did," Lewis said. "They said her husband died in suspicious circumstances. They said it could have been an accident, but the fact that he was so wealthy and she had come from nothing and stood to be a millionaire after he died made the detectives look into it. I was there when Detectives Swan and Brand called the detectives who investigated the case. It was 5 years ago, and then those detectives said that they could never get any evidence on her, and they really didn't have an opinion either way as to whether she did it or not. They said there was no evidence that it was murder." "How did he die?" I asked him. "Apparently he owned several large farms, and he went there one day to inspect one of them. They found him in a grain silo. He'd smothered to death due to the weight of the grain." I shuddered. How ghastly. The detectives who investigated the case told Swan and Brand that while her first husband owned farms, he wasn't a farmer himself, so probably didn't know not to climb up and go looking in the top of the silo. They think he just overbalanced and fell in. Or perhaps he was walking down the grain and someone opened the chute at the bottom. As I said, they said they had absolutely no evidence. "I wonder how likely an accident like that would be," Basil said. "They said it's a fairly common type of accident, but the thing was that Violet had accompanied him to the farm. They weren't in sight of any of the farm workers, because the workers were on a different part of the property, drenching sheep." "So Violet might have murdered her first husband and then murdered you?" I asked Lewis. Lewis paled, a feat in itself considering he was a ghost, but Basil shook his head. "Why didn't she wait until she was married to Lewis?" "Lewis did tell her that he'd changed the will and that she was his only beneficiary," I pointed out. "Still, it would have been better to wait to kill him." Lewis interrupted. "Hey, don't talk about me like I'm not here. It wasn't Violet, I tell you. It was Norbert." I looked at Basil. "We need to do some investigating." "Norbert and Violet?" I nodded. "I'll call Tara and ask her to talk Duncan into getting some information on them." Chapter 15. It had been Basil's idea to follow Norbert and Violet. I had agreed, simply because I wanted to have some alone time with Basil. I mean, I couldn't see what they could possibly do to implicate themselves. After all, Lewis was already dead. I was also concerned that the detectives still thought that Basil was the murderer, but at least they were looking into other suspects, even if it was just to discount them. Hopefully they would turn up something. Basil and I were parked outside the hotel in which Norbert and Violet were staying. "What are we going to do if they stay in there all day?" I asked him. Basil pulled a face. "I actually hadn't thought of that. Surely they have to come out at some point." "Well, we can't really look through a window," I said. "Someone might see us. What if it doesn't work?" "Don't worry, it will." Basil smiled at me. I smiled too. I felt I should have chosen my words more carefully. After all, Basil must have seen this as his last hope. If we didn't uncover the murderer soon, then the detectives were likely to arrest Basil. After what seemed like an eternity, the motel door opened. Basil grabbed my arm. "Look." I was already looking. In fact, I had been doing nothing but staring at the door for the last hour. Violet walked out first. She was impeccably dressed, as always. Even from the distance, I could see she had on a pair of heels and a rather fancy dress for the country. Norbert followed her out. He, too, was nicely dressed. When they reached the car, they turned to each other and appeared to be arguing. "I wonder what that's all about," I said. Basil craned his neck. "I wish we were close enough to hear." "Wouldn't it be good if we could bug them like they do in the movies?" I said. "And it would be good if we could put a tracking device on the car too, like they do in the movies." I laughed. Even though our mission was serious, I was enjoying being in Basil's company. After they exchanged words, they got into the car and turned north onto the highway. "A good thing they're on the highway," Basil said. "I hope they stay on it for a while, because then they won't notice anyone following them."
"They wouldn't expect to be followed anyway," I said, "so they won't be looking out for it."
"Good point." Basil accelerated. "Violet sure likes to drive fast."
"Do you think she could have killed Lewis?"
Basil shot me a quick glance. "I don't know. It was either her or Norbert, or both of them together, or Simon Smarts, or Theo Derringer, or Simon and Theo together." I counted them off on my fingers. "That gives us 6 suspects if you count a combination as a suspect." Basil seemed amused by my reasoning. "Okay, I suppose you could see it that way."
"What's your gut feeling about it, Basil?"
Basil's expression turned serious. "You know, I don't have one. I usually get gut feelings about most things, but I think I'm too close to it this time. What about you?"
"I'm the same. I think I'm too close to it too, what with you being the main suspect."
I felt embarrassed as soon as I said it, but Basil didn't seem to think there was anything untoward about my words. He simply nodded. "We have Simon Smarts, who, if he was the embezzler, certainly had a motive. Violet had a motive too, because she believed that everything would be left to her. That doesn't mean I'm ready to rule out Theo or Norbert, because either of them could have had a motive that we haven't found out yet."
"Simon Smarts does seem the obvious one," I said, "but if he was so obvious, you'd think the police would have nabbed him by now."
"But we only went to the police with that information yesterday," Basil pointed out. I agreed.
"Still, you'd think they should have found that out themselves."
We were now on the outskirts of town, and Basil had to be more careful about not being seen. He stayed a few cars behind them. They turned left into a side street, but Basil went straight ahead.
"They went down there," I said. "That side street just back there."
"Yes, I know," Basil said. "That only leads to a parking area, and if we went in there they would see us for sure. I'm going to go around the block and park in an adjacent parking area. With any luck, we'll be able to see them from there." When Basil reached the parking area, we couldn't see them, although we could see Violet's car. "What should we do?" I asked him. "I'm a bit reluctant to get out of the car in case they see us, but I don't suppose we have any choice." Basil and I got out of the car, and then I spotted them at the end of an alley.
"Look, over there."
I clutched Basil's arm and marveled at how muscled his arm was. I silently chided myself. "Keep your mind on the job, Laurel." We followed them a distance and saw them go into the entrance of the large brick courthouse.
"I wonder why they went in there."
Basil frowned. "No idea."
"See that big window there? What if we look through it?"
"That's a good idea, Laurel." We both walked over to the window and peered in. Fortunately, Norbert and Violet had their backs to us, and they were bending over a counter. There were rows of forms stacked on the counter. "Let's get out of here," Basil said. "When they leave, we'll go in and see what those forms were." They were the forms on the far right of the counter. Basil and I crossed the road and sat in a little coffee shop that overlooked the courthouse. Basil's phone made a noise, and he checked it, then waved it at me. "Simon Smarts again. He's texted me a few times now to ask if I want to sell Lewis's firm." I was about to reply when I looked up and noticed the other occupants of the dark coffee shop.
"Don't look now, Basil," I said in a low tone. "It's Ian."
"Who's the lady with him?"
"That's his girlfriend, Audrey. He told Mum that he'd broken up with her."
"It sure doesn't look like they've broken up," Basil said. I looked over at them once more, and they were holding hands and staring into each other's eyes. My stomach turned, and I felt sorry for Audrey. I'm sure she had no idea that her boyfriend was so duplicitous, but then again, I supposed I couldn't blame him. Mum had probably put pressure on him. Basil and I spoke for a few moments, and then looked up to see Ian standing at the table. "Hello, I'm just leaving," he said, and then he hurried away. Audrey was still sitting at the table. "What was that all about?" Basil asked me.
"I don't think he wanted us to see him with Audrey in case we reported back to Mum," I said.
"What were we saying? Did he overhear us?" "I think we were talking about following Violet and Norbert," Basil said, but then he tapped my arm. "Quick, they're leaving." We hurried out the front, but as the coffee shop was small, we were blocked by people waiting to pay. By the time we excused ourselves and made our way through them, Violet and Norbert were nowhere to be seen. "What should we do now?" I asked Basil. "Let's go inside the building and see what forms they were looking for. Remember, they were the ones on the far right." We both hurried into the building. I was keen to see what the form could be. Basil got there first. He held up the form to show me, and, with shock, I saw that it was an application for a marriage license. Before I could process the information, Basil's phone sounded. "Simon Smart's again?" I asked him. He shook his head. "No, it's from Theo Derringer this time. He wants to meet me for dinner tonight." "I wonder what he's up to." Basil smiled. "We'll soon find out." "We? Surely he didn't invite me too." Basil was busy texting away. When he finished, he looked up. "I told him that you and I would meet him tonight at 7. I felt a bit awkward. After all, I wasn't officially Basil's significant other, yet. "He might not be up to anything as such," Basil continued. "It's an awkward situation with him now running Lewis's firm, and I will own the firm once probate is through. He and I should have a lot to discuss in that regard, but we can also use this opportunity tonight to see," I chipped in, "to see if we think he murdered Lewis." Basil nodded. "Exactly." Chapter 16. The restaurant, the most expensive in the nearby town, was nestled at the bottom of a little green hill. The entrance was grand, and the drive was gravel flanked by rows of alternating white and blue agapanthus flowers. As soon as I left the car's air conditioning, I was hit by a wall of heat. Not oppressive heat, but that type of warmth that holds the promise of something to come, like just before a thunderstorm on a warm summer's night. It was now a warm summer's night, but there was no sign of a thunderstorm. Perhaps it was a spiritual thunderstorm brewing. And perhaps Theo Derringer was the killer, and Basil and I might be putting ourselves in danger. With a shake of my head, I put my fanciful notions aside and walked with Basil into the luxury of the restaurant. Basil put a guiding hand on my back, and my skin tingled at his touch. It would have been a lovely night under other circumstances, and I had to admit that, surrounded by such a romantic environment, I was putting my earlier nervousness aside and falling into the cozy ambience. I took in the soft glow of the table candles, the crisp white tablecloth, the immaculate service, and the beautifully dressed patrons whispering to each other and smiling. We were shown to our table, where Theo was already waiting. He stood up, shook Basil's hand, and kissed mine. I at once felt dirty. I wondered if I could surreptitiously pour water onto my hand and scrub it. As that was not possible, I had to settle for a shudder. Basil and I sat next to each other, opposite Theo, and when our knees touched, it was as if 1,000 volts of electricity passed through me. Basil caught my eye and smiled, and I figured, he had felt it too. Immediately, a champagne cart arrived tableside. As I sipped my French champagne, Basil and Theo soon became lost in accounting talk, and I zoned out with all their talk of accelerated depreciation, acid test ratios, accelerated cost recovery systems, abnormal earnings valuation models, and then a whole bunch of acronyms. I didn't mind. To the contrary, I was happy simply to sit in a beautiful restaurant with good company and fine food. Well, I wasn't counting Theo as good company. He reminded me of Mr. Burns more so than ever. I was eating the main course when something Theo said grabbed my attention. Basil repeated the figure, and that made my mouth fall open in shock. "Is that a serious offer?" Basil asked Theo. Indeed it is, Theo said. I've wanted my own accounting firm for a while now, and being the second in command to Lewis, I'm familiar with his firm. Plus, after working for Lewis, I realized that I need to be in business for myself. He paused and shot Basil a look. No offense meant. None taken, Basil said. Theo leant forward, and the energy around the table changed instantly. His eyes flickered from side to side, and once more he reminded me of a snake, a particularly venomous snake. Has anyone else made you an offer for Lewis's firm? Theo had obviously injected as much of a casual tone as he could manage into his voice, a tone that feigned complete disinterest. I looked at Basil to see if he was fooled by this ploy. Basil hesitated. I knew Basil well enough to know that when he hesitated, he was seriously thinking what to do or say. Finally, he looked up, straight at Theo. Simon Smarts has already made me an offer. I was watching Theo carefully, and he did not react at first. A few moments later, he plastered what looked like a completely fake expression of surprise on his face. Oh, really? Simon Smarts of It's a Cruel World? Basil nodded. Did you accept his offer? Theo asked him, although I suspected he already knew the answer to his question. No, Basil said. Do you know Simon Smarts well? Yes, Theo said, and then looked down at his plate. After a moment or two, he pushed on. Are you considering Simon's offer? Basil once again hesitated before answering. I'm considering all offers. I'm not in a rush, because it will take a while before probate is through. Quite right, Theo muttered. Did Lewis mention Simon Smarts to you at all? Yes, he did. I mentioned that to you only recently. Theo nodded. I don't know how to say this, but perhaps Lewis already told you. Once you own the business officially, you'll find out anyway. I just feel bad saying anything at all. Please go on, Basil said. Is this confidential? Theo asked him. Yes, of course, Basil said. And I would like my offer for Lewis's business to be completely confidential as well. Yes, of course, Basil said again. Please continue. What did you want to tell me about Simon Smarts? Oh, it's so embarrassing, Theo said in a less than convincing tone. As you know, Lewis was auditing Simon's firm, and you know that he had found evidence of embezzlement. And I mean, it was for a lot of money. Basil nodded. Did Lewis tell you that it was Simon himself who was embezzling? No, Basil said evenly. Lewis only mentioned that he had uncovered evidence of embezzlement in the firm. He didn't mention anyone by name. Theo rubbed his hands together in the best impression of Mr. Burns to date. I didn't want to say anything about the embezzlement when you mentioned it before because... His voice trailed away. I did not want to gossip without evidence, but I think Simon Smarts only wants to buy the business from you so he can cover up the evidence of embezzlement. Basil shrugged. Well, someone has to audit it. The embezzlement will show up sooner or later. Theo nodded vigorously, so vigorously that he dislodged his glasses. He stuck them back on rapidly, a move which caused me to think that he did, in fact, have the reflexes of a snake. Quite so, he said effusively. Perhaps he was hoping that Lewis had not told you or me about the embezzlement, which gives him more time to bury the evidence, and perhaps even repay the money. Basil shot me a furtive look. I'm no mind reader, but I figured he was thinking what I was thinking. It had just occurred to me that Theo had been involved in the embezzlement with Simon Smarts, and now was double-crossing him. I was looking forward to discussing it all with Basil later that night. Just as I was multitasking by daydreaming about the rest of the evening alone with Basil, and at the same time shoveling creme brulee smothered with cream and ice cream into my mouth, there was a commotion. I looked up to see Detectives Brand and Swan striding to our table. Everyone in the room had stopped eating, and their heads were turned to them. The officers were far from acting discreetly. My heart plummeted. Detective Brand pulled Basil to his feet roughly, while Swan pulled his arms behind him and slapped handcuffs on him. "Basil Sandalwood, we're arresting you for the murder of Louis Lowes." He told him that he did not have to answer any questions, but the rest was a blur. All I knew was that Basil said, "Stay safe, Laurel. Take my car," and I wondered who would be paying for dinner. The room swam, and I clutched my head and then my stomach, waiting for the wave of nausea to pass. "I'll get this," Theo said in a sympathetic tone. "I'm sure you'll want to leave now." I stammered my thanks. He seemed almost kindly then, and he too looked shocked, almost as shocked as I was. I wanted to do something, but what? It was all up to Basil's lawyer now, unless I could find the murderer by myself. Chapter 17. I got home, parked Basil's car, and staggered into the funeral home. I leant back against the door and then slipped to the ground, the tears now falling freely. Ernie appeared and stood looking at me for a while. He had never seen me in this state before, and I think he was at a loss for words. I wiped my eyes. "I'm all right," I said in a weak voice. "I'm sorry," he said, and then he vanished. I was a little annoyed with myself. I should have asked him where Louis was. I walked up the stairs to my apartment and looked in the bathroom mirror. I laughed in spite of myself. I looked like a clown. Long black streaks of mascara were running down my face, and my eyes were black pools where I had wiped them. I washed my face and forced myself to take some deep breaths. I thought I should make a nice hot cup of tea and then think about the suspect some more. No sooner had I sat down than Tara called. "OMG, Laurel, are you all right? Duncan just told me what happened." The tears threatened to fall again, but I held them back. "No, I'm not all right. Basil didn't do it." "Of course he didn't," Tara said. "Do you want me to come over?" I thought about it for a moment, but then thought that perhaps she should stay at home. I didn't know if it was Duncan's night off, but if it was, I didn't want to interrupt their alone time. Duncan had such a heavy work schedule, and they barely had time together as it was. "Thanks, Tara, but I'll just have an early night. I've got a crashing headache." "I'm not surprised. Anyway, Duncan told me something else. I don't know if it will help, though." My interest was piqued. "What is it?" "Okay, so you asked me to get Duncan to look into Norbert's and Violet's backgrounds to see if they had criminal records," she said. I nodded, and then realized that Tara couldn't see me. "Yes, but we'd already found out that Violet's husband died in somewhat suspicious circumstances, and that's how she became a millionaire." "Oh, you know that already?" "Yes," I said, "but thanks for looking into it anyway." "Oh, but there's more?" Tara's tone was excited, and I held my breath, waiting for her to continue. "Duncan said there was nothing on record, so I asked him to ask an old buddy from Sydney. He was able to call in a favour, and he found out that Norbert was suspected along with Violet. The police seemed to think that the two of them were having an affair, and that's why Violet's husband was killed. Apart from all the millions of dollars, of course." I tapped my chin. "But why didn't Norbert and Violet get married then?" I asked her. "I'm not sure what you mean," Tara said. "Okay, let's assume for a moment that Norbert and Violet have killed Louis now to get Louis's millions. Basil and I were snooping around, and we saw them get a marriage license from the courthouse. Whatever stopped them getting married if they both killed Violet's husband back then?
I don't know, Tara said. I don't have a head for all this detective stuff.
She forced a laugh.
Don't worry, Laurel. I'm sure Basil's name will be cleared.
I wondered whether Tara really did think that, or whether she was only saying it to make me feel better, but I didn't want to put her on the spot by asking her. I thanked her for finding out the information and then hung up. I stirred 2 large spoonfuls of sugar into my tea. I don't usually have sugar in my tea, but I felt I needed it. What could I make of this new information? It didn't make sense. I wanted to speak to Lewis, but Lewis was nowhere to be seen. I stared at my tea so long that it went cold. I took my cup and poured out the remains of the tea. I still felt at a loss, so decided to go downstairs to my office and do some paperwork. That would take my mind off things. I was too tired to make any sense out of the whole Norbert and Violet thing anyway. I hadn't even reached my office when Ernie materialized in front of me.
"How's it going, kid? Good to see you've stopped crying."
I leant against the wall. I meant to ask you before, have you seen Lewis around?
"No, I haven't."
He shook his head as if for emphasis.
"I've been wondering where he was."
"It's highly doubtful that he has crossed over," I said, "given that his murder hasn't been solved yet."
"Have you and that accountant got any clues as to who it could be?"
I pulled a face. "The cops arrested Basil tonight." Ernie's jaw dropped open, and I continued. "And just now, Tara told me that Norbert and Violet knew each other when Violet's husband was killed, leaving her a millionaire." Ernie looked thoughtful.
"Do you think they were in it together?"
"Put it this way, they're both now at the top of my suspects list. The only other ones on that list are Simon Smarts and Theo Derringer. I don't trust either of those men, but I'm beginning to think that they were just doing dirty business rather than committing murders."
"Can I do something to help?"
he asked. I was touched. "That's lovely of you, Ernie," I said. "Actually, there is something you could do. Could you please go over to Violet and Norbert's motel room and see if they say anything that would implicate them in Lewis's murder?" Ernie looked smug.
"I've already done that," he said. "I've spent a lot of time over there. They haven't said a thing about murdering Lewis. In fact, Norbert keeps telling Violet that he thinks it was suicide."
"Suicide?" I echoed. "Even the police didn't bring that one up."
Ernie nodded. "Yes, he was going on and on about a well-known case in England where they found the risers cut, and people were arrested at first, but then the police thought it was suicide."
I was shocked. "Well, that means that they didn't do it. That means I'm back to Theo or Simon."
"It doesn't mean anything of the sort."
Ernie shook his head.
"It just means that Norbert and Violet weren't in it together."
I rubbed my temples. "Yes, of course you're right. I'm not thinking clearly." Then something else occurred to me. "Ernie, why didn't you tell me this about Norbert and Violet sooner?"
Ernie smirked. "You didn't ask."
And with that, he vanished. I was irritated with Ernie, but at the same time I was pleased with the information he had just given me. So Norbert and Violet weren't in it together. Could it have been Norbert by himself? But what did he have to gain? Well, there were Violet's millions. And what about Violet by herself? After all, she thought she was to inherit all of Lewis's estate. My only problem with that was that I couldn't figure out why she hadn't waited until after she was married to him to kill him. That is, unless she truly was in love with Norbert. This was doing my head in. I walked back up the stairs and thought about going to bed. I knew there was no way I would be able to sleep, but I had to do something to take my mind off it. My television wasn't yet working, so I opened my iPad and logged into Netflix. I searched through what seemed like hundreds of movies and couldn't find anything I'd like. I figured that the romantic movies would remind me that Basil was in custody, and the action movies would make me tense. It was then that I decided to paint the walls. I had plenty of energy, so much energy that I felt like a current of electricity was running through me. Painting seemed like the ideal distraction. I went to the main bedroom where I had stored my cans of paint, rollers, paint tray, and brushes. I got out a can of paint, cracked open the lid, and gave the paint a good stir, and then carried the can into the bedroom in which I had been sleeping. I removed the temporary bed and my clothes. I then attacked the walls, formulating a plan with each brush stroke. What did I know for sure? The only thing I knew for sure was that Norbert and Violet weren't in it together. That meant I had 5 options. It was either Norbert, Violet, Theo, Simon, or Simon and Theo in it together. I needed to speak to Lewis. He hadn't crossed over, I was sure of that. So where was he? I would have to summon him. I opened my door and tried calling out to him, with no response. Ernie hadn't seen him, so that left me only one option. I had to hold a séance. Chapter 18. It was well past midnight when I finally stopped painting. The paint fumes were overbearing, so I decided I'd have to sleep downstairs in the funeral home. I could sleep well enough in a chair. I had slept in a seat on the Melbourne to Sydney overnight train many a time when I was at university. It wasn't the most pleasant night's sleep, but at least I knew it was doable. The old sash window in the bedroom had partially closed itself, and with a sigh I walked over to push it open all the way. I looked out. The window faced the sheep's paddock, and I could see them now, like white balls of cotton illuminated by the moonlight. The moon was waning, but still bright. A shadow moved close to the building. Someone was there. I looked again, but there was nothing. It must have been a trick of the moonlight, my imagination. Still, the hair stood up on the back of my neck, and my heart beat ever faster. I shook my head. I was tired. Basil had been arrested, and my thoughts were going into overdrive. Whoever had killed Lewis couldn't possibly be after me. I didn't even know which of the suspects it could be, so I was safe. I kept telling myself that while I dragged my pillows and blankets down the stairs. I infinitely preferred this climate to Melbourne's. No matter how hot it got here during the day, the nights were guaranteed to be cool. I awoke on the floor of my office. My office chair had proven more uncomfortable than I had imagined, so the floor it had to be. It wasn't so bad, and I was sure that I'd had about 4 hours' sleep. I staggered to my feet and stretched before heading for the nearest coffee machine. The Nespresso machine in the funeral home kitchen was, as always, a welcome sight. I turned it on, and when it had warmed up, I dropped in one pod. The ensuing sound was my most favorite sound in the world. Soon, I felt almost human again. I thought if I kept overdosing on coffee, I might make it through the day. I don't remember being this tired. Now, what had I forgotten to do? I looked in my appointment book. No services today. Oh, that's right. I was going to hold a séance. I had never used a Ouija board before, but Tara had given me one as a gift many years ago. I had kept it locked in one of the filing cabinet drawers in my office, because if my mother ever saw it, her head would surely rotate 360 degrees, and she would call in an exorcism team. Of that, I had no doubt. Mum thought scented candles were a tool of the devil, so she would probably need years of therapy if she ever saw me using a Ouija board. Even after 2 coffees, I still felt sleepy and groggy. I debated whether or not I should go outside to get some fresh air, but had another coffee instead. I still felt fuzzy-headed. I unlocked the drawer and brought out the Ouija board with something akin to a guilty sense of excitement. Surely this would bring Lewis through from wherever he was. I knew that murdered people often took a long time to come through, but he had seemed quite fine with that. I supposed it had taken a while to sink in. I needed to ask Lewis questions about each one of the suspects because Basil might be denied bail. Who would know? I couldn't take that risk. I had to find out who the murderer was, and fast, and I had to do it by myself, with help from Lewis, if possible. I took the Ouija board to the memorial service room. I hoped that this room, given that Lewis's memorial service had been held in it, would be the place he would resonate with the most. I walked past the empty coffin — there was always one on display for prospective clients — and opened the lid. It was a habit of mine. I didn't like staying in the same room as a coffin unless the lid was open. Call me weird. I walked to the back of the room and sat down with the Ouija board just in front of the platform. "Is anyone there?" I said loudly. "Lewis, are you there?" Nothing. I gripped the wooden planchette more tightly and asked again, more loudly this time. "Lewis? Lewis, are you there?" I was practically yelling now. I wondered if I needed more than one person. After all, this was my first time using the Ouija board. I tried once more, and this time I could actually feel Lewis coming through. Just then, the door to the memorial room flew open. I looked up with shock. Surely Lewis wouldn't use the door.
"Laurel, where are you? I heard you yelling. Are you there?"
I was filled with utter horror. It was my mother. I ducked down, hoping she wouldn't see me. I frantically looked for somewhere to hide the Ouija board. I eyeballed the coffin. It was on the other side of the aisle, and my mother would see me if I went for it and dropped the board in there. Perhaps if I was very quiet, she would go back out and look elsewhere, and then I could hide it in the coffin. I also debated whether to stand up and just walk quickly towards her and then steer her out of the room. Too late. My mother had sneaked down the aisle. She caught sight of me. Her reaction was precisely as I imagined it to be. She was struck speechless. Her hands flew to her throat. She went as white as any ghost I had ever seen and staggered backwards. She fainted, and as she did so, she fell into the coffin. I ran over to see if she was all right, but she looked quite peaceful lying there in the coffin. I wondered what to do. Should I throw water on her? Perhaps better to leave well enough alone. I knew she was going to give me an earful and then some. Just then, Lewis materialized. "You were yelling for me?" "Yes," I said. "Where have you been?" He didn't answer, but looked past me into the coffin. "Oh, I'm so sorry about your mother, Laurel. When did that happen?" He tried to pat me on the shoulder, but his hand passed right through me. "She's not dead," I said. "She just passed out when she saw me using the Ouija board. Anyway, where have you been?" "Have I been somewhere?" Lewis said. "I thought I'd been asleep. Being dead takes quite some getting used to, you know. I thought I was here only yesterday." "No, it's been a while." Lewis simply shrugged. "Well, I just found out who killed me, and I feel I'm going to go now. You know, crossover or whatever you live ones call it." He looked quite pleased. "Wait," I said. "You haven't told me who killed you." Lewis was already fading. "Goodbye, Laurel," he said. "Norbert killed me." And with that, he was gone. "Norbert is the murderer," I yelled after him. He reappeared. "Yes, can I go now?" Just then the memorial room door flew open for the second time that day. It was Norbert. Chapter 19. "How did you know?" Lewis and I exchanged glances. Norbert hurried down the aisle to me and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Ian came to my motel room to invite me to church and said that you and Basil were following us the other day." "Ian's full of—" Norbert cut me off. "I heard you say I was the murderer. Who were you talking to?" "Lewis," I said. "I can talk to dead people." Norbert looked as though he were about to strike me. "What a load of—" He broke off and pulled me to him. "Tell me how you found out." "Lewis told me," I said. Then an idea occurred to me. Lewis is here right now. Ask me anything, something I can't know. Lewis will give the answer. Norbert's face was threatening, cold, hard. I don't have time for games. What do you have to lose? I asked him. Just one thing, please. I don't want to hurt you, but I need to know what you know. Who else knows? I could feel my heart thumping in my chest. I was panicking too much to answer. Tell me, Norbert yelled. He grabbed the tiebacks from a nearby curtain, pushed me into a chair, and used the brocade cords to tie me to it. He grabbed the chair I was sitting on and shook it violently. I felt tears well up at the corners of my eyes and struggled to calm down. I tried to control my breathing, but it was coming out in short, rapid bursts. I was worried I would hyperventilate. Lewis charged at Norbert, but predictably flew straight through him harmlessly. Norbert didn't even notice, much less react. I won't ask again, Norbert said flatly. I struggled to think of a way to buy myself some time. Before I could finish speaking, there was a loud knock. I knew this was my opportunity, but before I could call out, Norbert grabbed a bunch of tissues from his pocket and stuffed them in my mouth. I desperately tried to scream, but could only manage a muffled cry. Norbert raised his finger to his lips, telling me to stay quiet. He walked to the door to answer it. "Hello, sir," I heard, and I realized whoever it was had entered the funeral home and come as far as the door to the memorial room. "Do you have a moment to talk about eternal judgment for your sins?" "Sins?" Norbert repeated. My heart sank when I realized it wasn't the police. These people wouldn't be able to help me, not unless I could get their attention. "No, I certainly do not," Norbert said rudely. "Now leave me alone. I'm busy." I struggled to break free of my bonds, but they were tied too tightly. I felt panic rise again and tried my best to fight it. "They're not going to be much help, Laurel," Lewis told me flatly. I looked at him with pleading eyes. He nodded at me. "I'll get Basil. If you can, try to buy some time." Lewis disappeared as soon as he stopped speaking. I shook my head, but too late. Basil was in custody, so he couldn't help me, and he was the only one who could hear Lewis. "We must insist. We shan't be responsible for your soul languishing forever," the man continued. I heard Norbert sigh loudly, and for the first time in my life I was overwhelmed with happiness at the mention of eternal damnation. "I said no." Norbert slammed the door loudly, causing the entire room to shake. I heard muffled yelling through the door as the strangers kindly explained that Norbert would burn in hell, and it was hard to disagree. Then again, I was almost thankful for Norbert for answering the door in my place. I'm not sure if dealing with them or being kidnapped would be worse. To my surprise, Norbert opened the door again. "Get out of here. Do you understand me? You're not welcome." At first I was confused, but I figured that Norbert probably expected them to stick around unless he stopped them. I tried my best to shake the chair and make some noise, but it was no good. I fell to the side and felt a sharp pain shoot through my chest as I landed heavily, but it hadn't made nearly as much noise as I'd hoped. Worse still, it was even harder to try to escape my bonds now that I was on the floor. As Norbert argued with the men, I tried to remove my makeshift gag. I rubbed my face against the floor and did my best to spit it out, but it didn't so much as budge. For a sickening moment, I wondered if Norbert had tied somebody up like this before. He was certainly good at it. The floor all but shook as Norbert yelled expletives that would make anyone blush. While I heard the strangers yelling back about holy vengeance and divine justice, their voices were getting softer. I realized they were leaving, and the door slammed again. I closed my eyes and tried to hold back tears as I heard Norbert returning. One of the men called out a passing shot. "There will be a sign from above that you're going straight to hell. Then you will believe. I cringed. Norbert's face was one of fury mixed with something that looked like fear. I wondered if he really was worried that he was headed for eternal damnation, given what Violet had told me about his childhood. I had just managed to spit the tissues out of my mouth, which was quite a feat. I had completely forgotten about my mother, until now. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the coffin shake. I looked at Norbert to see that his face had gone pale. My mother rose slowly out of the coffin, one hand outstretched. Before her head had completely cleared the edge, she pointed to where I had been standing, which was where the unfortunate Norbert was now standing.
"You shall burn in hell," she screamed. "You shall suffer eternal damnation for your sins. There is no escape."
Norbert backed away in terror. My mother must have been blind with rage, literally, because she continued to scream about eternal damnation and continued to point at Norbert. He stumbled backwards and then fell hard into a row of seats. Just then, the door burst open, and both detectives, followed by Duncan, Brian, and other uniformed officers, rushed into the room, their guns drawn. The detectives extricated Norbert from where he had fallen amongst the chairs. He didn't resist. He just kept looking over his shoulder at my mother, who was sitting up in the coffin, still pointing and with a blank look on her face. Duncan ran to me and untied me. "Are you hurt, Laurel? Do you need medical help?" "No," I said as I struggled to my feet, "but I think my mother might." Duncan looked at the coffin and then back at me. "What's your mother doing in the coffin?" I shrugged. "You'd have to ask her that." I certainly hoped that he wouldn't. Some of the police officers escorted Mum from the room, presumably so she could get medical help. I hoped that would take a very long time, because I knew without a doubt that I was in for it when she came to her senses. I would have to keep the funeral home door locked from now on, even when I was working in there throughout the day. "How did you know it was Norbert?" I asked Duncan. Duncan shrugged. "Not a clue. You'd have to ask the detectives." Detective Brand came over right on cue. "That woman, Violet Pendlebury, called us. She said she realized that Norbert was the one who had killed Lewis. She also now suspects him of killing her husband." "Her husband?" I repeated, but Detective Brand must have thought I knew nothing about that matter. "Yes," he said. "Her husband had an accident, and she inherited the money. There was an inquiry at the time, but there was no evidence against her. Now the investigation will be reopened, and Norbert will be looked into this time." "But why would Norbert kill Lewis?" I asked him. "What was his motive?" "Violet was a millionaire, and she and Norbert were planning to get married a year ago, but then she started dating Lewis and then broke up with Norbert. She was about to break up with Lewis and marry Norbert after all, when Lewis told her that if she'd marry him, she would inherit everything. Apparently that was the last straw for Norbert." Brand rubbed his chin. "Norbert and Violet had a fight, and he told her he'd killed Lewis for her." "He admitted it?" I was shocked. Detective Brand nodded. "And apparently he thought that Violet wouldn't mind. Between you and me, she's a piece of work, but apparently she draws the line at murder." My head was spinning. This was worse than one of those Housewives episodes. Still, it looked as though it was a happy ending after all. Apart from Lewis, of course. "Is Basil okay?" I asked Brand. The detective looked slightly embarrassed and shifted from one foot to the other. "Yes, he's been released." And with that, he hurried away. "Laurel, how do you get yourself into those scrapes?" Duncan asked me. "Not you too." I shook my finger at him. "My mother's going to rant and rave at me as it is." Chapter 20. I took a long, slow sip of my coffee and sighed deeply. It was finally over. I hadn't been able to enjoy coffee, really enjoy it, like this for as long as I could remember. This whole sequence of events had been one long nightmare, and I felt as though I'd finally woken up. I took a moment to wonder if perhaps my excess consumption of coffee had made me more on edge during the whole ordeal, but laughed it off as I started my fifth for the day, popping the pod inside the Nespresso machine and turning it on. I thought about how much I loved the sound of the coffee machine. It wasn't a nice sound, as such. Actually, it was quite the opposite. It made a monstrously loud roar, accompanied by a kind of harsh, grinding whir. Despite that, I loved it dearly. Just hearing it made me think just how much I delighted in the smell and taste of coffee. The machine clicked off, and I poured the coffee into my usual cup. The poor thing was deeply, irreversibly stained, and with a grin, I imagined the horror any poor guest would feel if I were to offer them a drink in it. Not that I would, of course, as it was my favorite mug. Even Basil didn't have those kinds of privileges. Not yet, anyway. I jumped as a loud knock came from the door. I got up and hurried to the door. As I opened it, I saw what I'd hoped to see. Basil was standing there, smiling broadly. "Hello, Laurel," he said as he hugged me tightly. I smiled and hugged him back. "Come in. Do you want coffee?" I asked when we detached from each other. Basil laughed. "I can tell you've had some already. Sure, I'll have one." He stepped inside and I closed the door behind him. We sat and talked for several minutes about anything and everything, really. Miscellany was the subject of the day, and we happily wasted time talking about what amounted to nothing at all, until Basil finally bit the bullet and brought it up. "I can't believe it was Norbert," he said with a sigh before continuing. "I know he wasn't the least likely suspect, but it bothers me all the same." I frowned, but Basil spoke again before I could interject. "What's worse is that I couldn't help you when he was here." I laughed. "You could hardly help that, Basil. After all, you'd been arrested. I don't blame you at all." I smiled reassuringly. I know, he replied, "but it upsets me all the same. I won't let that happen again." "Well, that's easy. Just don't get accused of murder from here on," I teased. Basil laughed. "All right, that's a deal." He spoke again after a brief pause. "Can you imagine it? Somebody killing somebody in cold blood like that. It's insane." "It's probably a good sign that we can't empathize," I smiled. "I know what you mean, though. If it's all the same, I don't want to talk about it anymore. Norbert's never going to be my problem again." I took another long drink of my coffee and set it down, satisfied. "I know you don't blame me, Laurel, but can I make you dinner tonight? In my house, just the two of us?" I smiled broadly. "That would be lovely." We continued to talk, thoroughly avoiding the subject of Norbert and Lewis's murder. Lewis hadn't appeared again. He'd moved on, and while I wasn't exactly his biggest fan, I found myself sort of missing him in a weird way. Maybe missing wasn't the right word. I appreciated that he wasn't here to make creepy remarks, but it was a strange feeling, almost as if he'd died again. This wasn't the case, though, and I knew it. Moving on was peaceful, and ghosts had always seemed more than happy to do so once they could. Plus, there's no way I could have enjoyed a moment alone with Basil like this if Lewis was still around. Not that Ernie was going anywhere, of course, but he wasn't here at this very moment, and I was enjoying it immensely. "Are you all right?" Basil asked, raising an eyebrow. I looked up at him. "I'm great. Just thinking is all." "That's a bad habit," he said with a smile. "Try not to do it too much." I laughed and nodded. "I'm definitely happier when I don't think. Maybe you're onto something." I went to start another coffee and hesitated. Was 6 too many? After a few moments of consideration, I realized that I must be going mad. Of course, 6 was nowhere near too many. I put a fresh pod inside and started up the machine. There was that sound again. "I know you don't want to talk about it, Laurel, but do you think it's really over?" Basil asked. I turned and raised an eyebrow at him. Of course I do. Norbert's been arrested, and Lewis himself accused him of being the killer. Norbert even confessed. Why do you ask? Basil seemed a bit put out. I just have a feeling something bad is going to happen, I suppose. Lewis wasn't always level-headed, and I wouldn't put it past him to accuse the wrong person based on a whim or emotional reaction. What if it was Violet? Violet? The same Violet who got the police and saved me? I asked. Basil smiled in response, and I continued. Besides, the police have found plenty of evidence on Norbert since his arrest, and it's hard to believe an innocent man would tie me to a chair and interrogate me about the crime. Anyway, Norbert confessed, I said once more. You're right, of course, Basil admitted. I just feel unsettled and can't put my finger on it. I'm just nervous somehow. I have a sense of foreboding, as if something horrible is headed this way. He shrugged. I chuckled. Well, your friend was murdered and you were blamed for it. I'd be more worried about you if you weren't upset about the whole ordeal. That's a good point. Maybe it's all my imagination. Basil was interrupted by another knock at the door. I closed my eyes and sighed. It wasn't necessarily the best state of affairs, but the only time I ever liked having guests was when it was Basil, and since he was here already, I knew I didn't want to open the door. To be honest, my entire encounter with Norbert had also left me quite shaken, and while I wasn't afraid as such, I'd noticed I was hesitating that little bit longer before opening the door or going anywhere alone. I composed myself and headed to the door, glancing at Basil along the way. He looked back and smiled reassuringly. I took a deep breath and grabbed the handle of the door. Before I opened it, I heard a voice that scared me to my core.
Laurel, I know you're in there.
My heart sank. I felt a cold chill rise throughout my entire body. I felt as though I would pass out. I released the handle and took a step backwards, being careful not to make any noise. I had to be as quiet as possible. Basil silently crossed to the door and met my gaze. We were both wide-eyed, and I could tell he was every bit as worried as I was.
Don't make me break this door down.
The doorknob wiggled violently as a body's weight slammed against it, and for a moment I feared the frame would give way. Thankfully it held, and I felt a sigh of relief leave me as I glanced at Basil. He'd also calmed down somewhat, but was clearly still very much on edge. After she'd seen me using a Ouija board, there was no way I was going to open the door to my mother. The end. The next audiobook in this USA Today Bestselling series is Ghost Stories. In Ghost Stories, when Laurel's mother, Thelma, hosts a group of writers in the belief they are writing about the Holy Ghost, she is horrified to find they are, in fact, writing ghost stories. Thelma decides to go on a road trip. Her GPS cannot get her there, so she hires an escort to show her the way. This turns out to be a grave mistake. Things are at rock bottom when the escort's naked body is found in Thelma's bedroom. Will Laurel be able to steer the police in the right direction before they arrest her mother, or will she come to a dead end? That's Ghost Stories, Book 4 in the Witchwood's Funeral Home series. You can find the series plus other audiobooks by Morgana Best at morganabest.com. You've just listened to Make the Ghost of It, Book 3 in the Witchwood's Funeral Home series, written by Morgana Best, narrated by Amy Soakes. Text copyright 2016 by Morgana Best. Audio production copyright 2023 by Morgana Best. If you've enjoyed this audiobook, please consider leaving a review and recommending on social media or directly to friends and family. This and other audiobooks by Morgana Best are available at morganabest.com. Thanks for listening.